She took the job. No one wanted at a Hells Angels yard. What happened next shocked everyone. You really want to work here? Nobody lasts a week. Clay Walker's voice cut through the yard like a blade, and Amber Collins didn't blink. $40 in her pocket, a backpack on her shoulder. A husband who had lawyers hunting her across 3 states. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "I'm not nobody." Before you find out what happened next, hit subscribe, follow this channel, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Amber Collins had not slept in a bed for 3 nights. She had slept in a bus station in Ohio then, in the back corner of a diner that let her nurse a single cup of coffee for 6 hours because the waitress felt sorry for her. And then finally in her car, a 14-year-old Honda with a cracked windshield and a check engine light that had been glowing for 200 miles. She had parked it behind a shuttered hardware store on the edge of town, curled her knees to her chest in the driver's seat, and stared at her phone until the battery died. Because every time she closed her eyes, she saw Nathan's name lighting up the screen again. 14 missed calls, then 31. Then somewhere around Indiana, she had stopped counting. She was 28 years old, and she had learned over the last 4 years that there were 2 kinds of fear. There was the fear of a man's fists, which she had felt exactly twice and never again, because the second time she had left the same night with nothing but a duffel bag and a decision that could not be undone. And then there was the other fear, the quieter one, the one that didn't leave bruises. The fear of paperwork, of bank accounts frozen without warning, of a private investigator's car parked outside her sister's house in Columbus for 4 days straight, until her sister had called her crying, begging her to just come back. Just talk to him. Just make it stop. That was the fear Nathan Mercer specialized in. He didn't need his hands. He had money, and money did things hands couldn't. So when Amber crossed the state line into a town she had chosen almost at random, because it was small, because it was 300 miles from anywhere, Nathan's name meant anything because a gas station map had shown her a dot on a highway she'd never heard of. She wasn't looking for comfort. She was looking for the one place a man like Nathan Mercer would never think to look. She found it by accident or by something that felt like fate, if she let herself believe in that kind of thing. Driving past a chain-link fence stretched for what looked like half a mile topped with rust and warning signs, she saw a hand-painted board nailed crookedly to a post, "Steel Haven Salvage Help, wanted serious inquiries only." Underneath, someone had scrawled in smaller letters, "Don't bother if you can't handle hard work." Amber sat in her car outside that gate for 11 minutes. She watched men come and go. Big men, tattooed arms, leather vests with patches. She didn't recognize the low grumble of motorcycle engines rolling in and out like a tide. She had heard of the Hells Angels the way most people had, through movies and news segments and secondhand stories that made her stomach tighten. Dangerous, violent, the kind of place a smart woman stayed away from. But then she thought about smart. She thought about how smart she had been for 4 years, married to a man who wore a $3,000 suit to church every Sunday, who opened doors for her in front of other people and slammed them in her face when they were alone. She thought about how smart hadn't saved her. Smart had almost gotten her killed with kindness, the slow, patient, suffocating kindness of being owned. Nathan Mercer would never in 100 years imagine his ex-wife walking through a gate like this one. That was reason enough. She got out of the car before she could talk herself out of it, smoothed down a blouse that hadn't been washed in 4 days, and walked toward the gate like she belonged there. A man built like a refrigerator stopped her before she'd gone 20 feet. Arms crossed, sunglasses, even though the sky was overcast, a patch on his vest that read, "Sergeant at Arms." "Help you with something." "I saw the sign," Amber said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "The job posting." The man she would learn later, his name was Deacon, looked her up and down. Not the way Nathan's friends used to look at her, but the way you'd size up a stray dog that had wandered onto your property, assessing whether it bit. "You sure about that?" "I need work," Amber said. "I don't scare easy." Deacon almost laughed. Almost. "Everybody says that. Wait here." He disappeared into the maze of scrap metal and stacked car frames, and Amber stood at that gate for what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 10 minutes, her heart hammering, her hands cold despite the summer heat, every instinct in her body screaming that she had made a terrible mistake, that she should get back in her car and drive. Drive anywhere, drive, until the tank ran dry. She didn't move. When Deacon came back, he wasn't alone. The man walking beside him moved differently than everyone else in the yard. Not faster, not louder, but with a kind of gravity that made the space around him feel smaller. He was maybe 55, gray beard, trimmed close, and neat gray hair slicked back under a bandana, forearms wrapped in faded tattoos that told stories Amber couldn't read. His vest bore a patch that simply said President, and underneath it, smaller iron. Clay Walker had run Steel Haven Salvage for 11 years. He had run the local charter of the Hells Angels for almost 20. And in that time, he had developed an ability that his brothers respected more than almost anything else about him. He could look at a person for exactly 4 seconds and know with unsettling accuracy whether they were lying. He looked at Amber for 4 seconds. "You're not from around here," he said. "Not a question." "No, sir." "You running from something." Amber's throat tightened. She thought about lying. She thought about all the ways she'd rehearsed this conversation in her head during the drive, all the careful half-truths she'd planned to tell. Standing in front of this man, none of them came out. "Yes," she said instead. Clay's eyes didn't change, but something in his posture shifted just slightly. "You in trouble with the law?" "No." "You in trouble with a man?" The question landed harder than she expected. Her jaw tightened. "Yes." Clay nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he already suspected. He glanced at Deacon, some silent conversation passing between them that Amber couldn't follow, and then looked back at her. "You really want to work here? Nobody lasts a week." "I'm not nobody," Amber said. For a moment, nobody spoke. The yard's noise seemed to fade around them, the distant clang of metal. The growl of an engine being tested, the murmur of men Amber couldn't see. Clay studied her the way he'd studied thousands of parts over the years, searching for the flaw that would tell him whether something was worth keeping or worth scrapping. "We've gone through 6 people in 2 weeks," he said finally. "Filthy work. Dangerous work. Most people quit by Wednesday." "I won't." "You don't know that." "I know I don't have anywhere else to go," Amber said, and for the first time her voice cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. "So I'm not going to quit something. That's the only thing I've got." Clay was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere behind him, a younger biker, lean maybe 30 tattoos climbing up his neck, leaned against a stripped-down truck frame and watched the exchange with open curiosity. "Paperwork," Clay said finally. Amber blinked. "What?" "We got files going back 15 years. Vehicle records, salvage titles, disposal logs. Nobody's touched half of it since the guy who used to do it retired. It's boring. It's dusty. It doesn't pay much better than the floor work, and it sure as hell won't impress anybody." "I don't need to impress anybody," Amber said. "I need to work." Clay held out his hand not to shake hers, but toward the office trailer sitting crooked on cinder blocks near the front of the yard. "Then go make yourself useful. Trailer's unlocked. Filing cabinets are a disaster. You last till Friday. We'll talk about whether this is permanent." "Boss Mike," Deacon said quietly, a warning note in his voice that Amber caught but didn't understand. "You sure?" Clay didn't answer him. He was still looking at Amber. "Friday," he repeated. "That's it. That's all I'm promising." Amber nodded, gripping the strap of her backpack so tight her knuckles went white. "Friday," she agreed. She didn't know, walking into that trailer for the first time, that she had just made a promise that would end up changing everything, not just for her, but for every person standing in that yard. The inside of the trailer smelled like mildew and forgotten decades. Amber stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at what could only be described as chaos given the shape of a room. Filing cabinets lined 3 walls, drawers hanging open like broken jaws, papers spilling out in yellowed cascades. A desk sat buried under boxes. The single window was so caked with dust that the afternoon light came through the color of weak tea. Nobody had told her where to start. Nobody had told her what exactly organizing 15 years of paperwork even meant. She was alone in a trailer that hadn't been cleaned since before she'd graduated high school, in a scrapyard run by men who looked like they could crush her with one hand 300 miles from anyone who knew her name. She almost laughed. It was either that or cry, and she'd done enough crying in the last 4 years to last several lifetimes. So she rolled up her sleeves, found a broom in the corner behind a stack of tires, and started. The first 2 hours were just survival, clearing a path, finding surfaces, discovering that the desk drawer stuck because a family of mice had built a nest inside a folder labeled 2009 intake. She didn't scream. She just sighed, set the folder aside, and kept moving. Around 4 in the afternoon, the door creaked open, and a woman about Amber's age stepped inside carrying 2 bottles of water. She had short, dark hair and a Steel Haven t-shirt with grease stains on the sleeves. "You're either really brave or really stupid," the woman said, setting one bottle on the least cluttered corner of the desk. "I'm Rosa. I run the front counter when we actually have customers who need a counter." "Amber." "Yeah, I heard." Rosa leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, studying the wreckage of the trailer with something like sympathy. "Clay tell you about Friday?" "He mentioned it." "He tells everyone about Friday. It's not really about Friday. It's about whether you're still standing Thursday night." Rosa's eyes flicked toward Amber's hands, which had gone raw from the dust and the paper cuts already accumulating. "You want some advice?" "Sure. Don't try to impress anybody. These guys have seen every kind of person walk through that gate. Cops trying to go undercover girlfriends, trying to prove a point. College kids who think working at a biker scrapyard sounds cool for a summer. They can smell fake from a mile away. Just do the work. That's it. That's the whole test." Amber looked around at the disaster surrounding her. "This is a lot of work. 15 years of nobody caring is a lot of work, yeah." Rosa pushed off the doorframe. "Holler if you need anything." And Amber, she paused, something more serious crossing her face. "Whatever you're running from, these are good men. Rough around every edge there is, but good. You're safer here than you think." She left before Amber could respond, and Amber stood there for a moment holding that sentence like something fragile. Safer here than you think. She wanted badly to believe it. But 4 years with Nathan Mercer had taught her that safety was a word people used right before it disappeared. She got back to work. By the end of the first day, she had cleared one filing cabinet and discovered something that made her stop cold. Buried in a folder marked simply, "MISC do not file." She found a stack of vehicle titles that didn't match any intake records she'd found so far. 9 vehicles, all processed through the yard within the same 3-month window, 2 years earlier, all missing chain of custody paperwork that should have existed by law. It wasn't necessarily suspicious on its own record-keeping this bad could explain almost anything, but something about the pattern nagged at her. She didn't say anything. Not yet. She'd learned in her marriage that pointing out problems before you understood who benefited from them could be dangerous. So she set the folder aside in a growing pile she'd started calling questions and kept working. Clay came by around 6 as the light outside had turned orange and long shadows stretched across the yard. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway, taking in the transformed corner of the trailer, 3 organized stacks where there had been chaos, a cleared path to the desk, the beginnings of a system. "You didn't quit," he said. "It's been 1 day. Most people quit by hour 3. He nodded toward the questions pile. "What's that?" Amber hesitated. Then, because something about his directness made lying feel pointless, she told him. 9 vehicles from about 2 years back. No chain of custody documentation. Could be nothing. Could be somebody just didn't file the paperwork. Clay's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened just slightly, like a man recalculating something. "You've been here 1 day, and you've found that." "I used to do bookkeeping," Amber said. "It wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that she'd spent 2 years managing the books for Nathan's real estate holding company before he decided a wife's job was to be seen and not employed. And in that time, she had developed an eye for the kind of small inconsistency that left unchecked became a very large problem. Numbers that don't add up bother me." Clay studied her for another long moment. "Keep that pile separate," he said finally. "Don't say anything to anybody else about it yet." "Why?" "Because I want to know about who's been in and out of this trailer the last 2 years before I know what you found," Clay said, and for the first time, Amber saw something in his face that looked almost like respect. "Good work today." He left before she could respond, and Amber sat alone in the trailer as the light faded outside, feeling something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Useful, not owned, not managed, useful on her own terms. She didn't know that first night, driving her rattling Honda to the motel, Rosa had recommended cheap, clean, safe, the kind of place that didn't ask questions, that the folder marked "MISC do not file" would end up at the center of everything that was about to happen. She just knew that for the first time in 4 years, she had slept 8 hours without waking up in a panic. Friday came and went, and nobody mentioned it again. By the end of her second week, Amber had transformed the trailer from a disaster into something resembling an actual filing system, color-coded folders, a rebuilt intake log, a cross-reference system she'd built by hand because the yard's ancient computer could barely run a word processor. She had also compiled a list of 43 discrepancies across 15 years of records, ranging from minor clerical errors to the kind of thing that in her previous life would have triggered an internal audit. She hadn't shown anyone the full list yet. Clay had told her to sit on it, and something in his tone had made clear that this wasn't a suggestion. What she had noticed in those 2 weeks was something else entirely. The yard itself and the men who ran it were nothing like what she'd expected walking through that gate. She'd expected menace. What she found was a kind of rough, unpolished decency that caught her off guard every single day. There was Big Sam, who could bench press a small car and who spent his lunch break every day on the phone with his 11-year-old daughter, his voice going soft and patient in a way that seemed impossible given the size of his hands. There was Deacon the sergeant at arms, who had sized her up so coldly at the gate, who she'd later found sitting in his truck after hours, quietly helping a teenage kid from town fill out a job application because the kid's own father was in prison and there was nobody else to teach him how. There was Rosa, sharp-tongued and quick to laugh, who mentioned once almost in passing that the club had paid for her mother's chemotherapy 2 years ago when the insurance company had denied the claim. No questions asked, no interest charged, nothing expected in return, except that she keeps showing up to work, which she did gladly, every single day. And there was Clay Walker, who said maybe 20 words a day, to Amber, who never asked about the messages she sometimes flinched away from on her phone, who never pushed for details about the man she was running from, but who had on her third day quietly mentioned that the club had a lawyer on retainer in case she ever needed to know that. "Why are you telling me this?" she'd asked. "Because you've got the look of someone who thinks she's alone," Clay had said, "and you're not." She hadn't known what to do with that. She still didn't most days, but slowly, carefully, she let herself believe it might be true. The messages from Nathan had not stopped. If anything, they had gotten worse. "Where are you? You can't hide from me forever, Amber. I've got people looking. It's just a matter of time. You know how this ends? It always ends with you coming back." She had stopped responding weeks ago, back before she'd even reached this town, but Nathan didn't need responses to keep talking. He talked like a man having a conversation with himself, certain that eventually the universe would rearrange itself back into the shape he preferred. What frightened her most wasn't the messages themselves. It was the fact that they kept arriving at all, which meant her number, despite the new SIM card, despite everything she'd done to disappear, was still somehow reaching him, or reaching someone who reached him. She hadn't told anyone at Stillhaven the specifics, not the whole truth about Nathan, his money, his connections, the private investigator he'd hired who had, according to her sister, photographed the Honda's license plate outside a gas station in Kentucky 3 weeks ago. She told Clay only the bare minimum: a bad marriage, a man who didn't understand the word no, a need to disappear. It was Rosa who noticed first that something had shifted. "You've been checking that phone like it's gonna bite you," Rosa said one afternoon, leaning against the trailer's doorframe with the sandwich in one hand. "Everything okay?" Amber set the phone face down on the desk, a reflex she'd developed without realizing it. "Fine. You know that's not a real answer, right?" Amber managed a thin smile. "It's the only one I've got right now." Rosa didn't push, but her eyes lingered a moment longer than casual conversation required, the way a person looks at something they're filing away for later. That evening, walking to her car in the gravel lot outside the yard, Amber noticed a black sedan parked across the street that hadn't been there that morning. Nondescript, tinted windows, the kind of car that was designed to be forgettable. Her stomach dropped. She got into her Honda quickly, hands shaking on the wheel, and drove 3 different directions before doubling back toward her motel, watching her mirrors the entire way. By the time she parked, her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The sedan was gone. It might have been nothing. It might have been someone waiting for a friend or a real estate agent between showings, or 100 harmless explanations. But Amber had learned in 4 years with Nathan Mercer that the harmless explanation was rarely the correct one. She didn't sleep that night. The following Monday, Clay found her in the trailer before the yard had fully woken up, before the first engines had started their morning growl. "You look like hell," he said. which from Clay was closer to a diagnosis than an insult. Didn't sleep much. He studied her for a long moment, that same 4-second read he'd given her the first day, except this time it stretched longer, more deliberate. Somebody following you. Amber's breath caught. Why would you ask that? Because Deacon clocked a black sedan sitting on Route 9 3 times this weekend. Different plates each time, which means somebody's swapping cars, which means somebody who knows what they're doing. Clay's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, the way a man discusses weather he's already prepared for. You want to tell me who you're actually running from, or you want to keep pretending it's nothing? Amber's hands trembled slightly as she set down the folder she'd been holding. 4 years of instinct told her to deflect, to minimize, to protect the secret, the way Nathan had trained her to protect everything about their marriage. The arguments nobody heard, the apologies that came with terms attached, the slow erosion of every friend and family member who might have noticed something wrong. But she was so tired of carrying it alone. His name is Nathan Mercer, she said quietly. He's my ex-husband. Real estate money, a lot of it inherited and made both. He spent the last 5 months trying to find me. Lawyers, a private investigator. He froze accounts I didn't even know he had access to. My sister said a man's been watching her house. Clay's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He hurt you. Amber's silence answered the question more clearly than words could have. How many times? Twice, she said. The second time I left that night. Clay nodded slowly, filing the information away, the same methodical way he filed everything else, without visible reaction, without judgment. Just quiet, careful processing. He know you're here in this town. I don't think so. I've been careful. New phone cash only. I haven't used a card in 6 weeks. She hesitated, but the messages keep coming. Somehow he's still reaching me. Show me. She unlocked her phone with shaking fingers and handed it over. Clay scrolled through the messages in silence, his expression unreadable, though something in the set of his shoulders had gone rigid. This isn't a man looking for his wife, he said, finally handing the phone back. This is a man who thinks he owns something that got away from him. That's exactly what it is, Amber said, her voice barely above a whisper. Clay was quiet for a long moment, and Amber watched something shift behind his eyes. A decision being made, Wade finalized. You're not going anywhere, he said finally. Not because of him. Clay, I don't want it to bring trouble to this place. You've all done more for me in 2 weeks than... I didn't ask what you wanted, Clay interrupted, not unkindly but firm enough that Amber stopped talking. I'm telling you how it's going to be. You keep coming to work. You keep doing what you've been doing. And if that sedan shows up on Route 9 again, my brothers are going to know exactly what it means and exactly what to do about it. Amber felt something crack open in her chest, not fear this time, but something closer to disbelief, the strange vertigo of being protected by someone with nothing to gain from it. Why would you do that for me? She asked. You barely know me. Clay considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. 2 weeks ago, you walked through that gate with $40 in a backpack, running from a man with more money than sense, and you didn't ask for pity. You asked for work. You found 9 fraud cases in a filing cabinet nobody's touched in 5 years, and instead of running your mouth about it, you came to me first. He paused. In my experience, that tells me everything I need to know about a person. Amber didn't trust herself to speak. She just nodded, blinking back something hot behind her eyes that she refused to let fall in front of him. Get back to work, Clay said softer now. And Amber, lock your car doors from now on, every time. He left and Amber sat alone in the trailer, staring at the mountain of paperwork still left to organize, feeling something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Not safety exactly. Not yet. But the first real flicker of it. Over the following days, something in the yard's atmosphere shifted, though nobody said it out loud. Deacon started parking his bike near the front gate during Amber's shift hours, ostensibly working on a rebuild that never seemed to progress. Big Sam took to walking Amber to her car at the end of each day, chatting about nothing in particular, his daughter's soccer games, a recipe his mother used to make, while his eyes swept the street with the practiced casualness of a man who had done this kind of quiet protection before. Rosa started texting Amber each morning to confirm she'd made it to work safely, a small thing that meant more than Amber knew how to express. Nobody made it a production. Nobody sat her down and announced they were protecting her. They simply did it the way they seemed to do most things, without asking for credit, without expecting thanks. The black sedan didn't return. But something else did. A letter delivered not to her, but to the yard's general business address, addressed simply to the management of Steel Haven Salvage. Clay opened it in his office on a Wednesday afternoon, and Amber, passing by with an armful of files, saw his expression change in a way she'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but something colder, more focused. "What is it?" she asked, stopping in the doorway. Clay held up the letter without a word. It was from a law firm Amber recognized instantly. Mercer's family had used them for 2 decades. The letter, dense with legal language, alleged that Steel Haven Salvage was knowingly harboring a woman who was in violation of a legally binding financial agreement, and warned that continued association could expose the business to significant legal liability. It was, Amber realized with a sick lurch in her stomach, the opening move of a war she hadn't wanted to bring to anyone's doorstep. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows I'm here." "Maybe," Clay said, setting the letter down with deliberate calm. "Or maybe he's guessing, sending letters like this to every scrapyard, every diner, every gas station within 300 miles of your last known location, hoping one of them panics and gives you up." "What if it's not a guess?" Clay looked at her, and for the first time Amber saw something in his expression that wasn't quite reassurance. It was resolve, cold and absolute. "Then he's about to learn," Clay said, "that this club doesn't scare, and it sure as hell doesn't fold." He folded the letter, slid it into a drawer, and looked back up at her with an expression that told her the conversation, as far as he was concerned, was over. "Get back to work, Amber." But Amber couldn't move, not yet, because standing there in that cramped little office, watching a man who owed her nothing decide without hesitation to plant himself between her and a threat that had already cost her everything once. She understood for the first time since she'd driven through that chain-link gate that she might have found something she'd stopped believing existed. Somewhere to belong. Somewhere that wouldn't ask her to disappear to keep the peace. She didn't know yet how far Nathan Mercer was willing to go, or how close he already was. She didn't know that the black sedan had only been the beginning, or that the letter in Clay's drawer was nothing compared to what would arrive at Steel Haven's gates in the weeks to come. She only knew that for the first time in 4 years, when she looked at the people standing around her, she didn't feel like something to be managed. She felt like someone worth fighting for. And somewhere 40 miles away, in an office with a view that cost more than most people's houses, Nathan Mercer set down his phone, looked at the private investigator sitting across from him, and said the words that would set everything in motion. "I found her." Nathan Mercer did not raise his voice. He never did. That was the thing people who didn't know him always got wrong. They expected a man like him, a man with his money and his name stitched into half the buildings downtown, to bark orders, to slam his fist on mahogany. Instead, he leaned back in his leather chair, laced his fingers together, and said it again, softer the second time, almost tender. "I found her." The private investigator across from him, a wiry man named Grissom, who had made a career out of finding people who didn't want to be found, cleared his throat. "We've got a probable location, not confirmed, a scrapyard outside a town most people couldn't find on a map. Runs under a motorcycle club, Charter Hells Angels." Something flickered across Nathan's face there and gone. "Bikers." "Yes, sir." "She's hiding behind bikers." Nathan almost laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "My wife, hiding behind grease and leather." He stood, walked to the window, looked out over a city that had made him rich twice over, once through inheritance, once through his own hand, and he had never once let anyone forget which mattered more to him. Send the letter to the business. See how they react. Men like that fold fast when lawyers get involved. They don't have the stomach for paperwork. And if they don't fold... Nathan turned back, and for just a moment, the mask he wore in boardrooms and courtrooms slipped, revealing something colder underneath. Then we remind them who they're dealing with. Back at Steel Haven, Amber didn't sleep that night either. She lay on the thin motel mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling, replaying Clay's words from that afternoon. This club doesn't scare, and it sure as hell doesn't fold, trying to let them settle into something like comfort. They didn't quite. Comfort had become a foreign language to her, one she recognized but no longer spoke fluently. At 5 in the morning, unable to lie still any longer, she got up, showered in water that never quite ran hot, and drove to the yard before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. She told herself, she wanted to get ahead on the filing. The truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. She didn't want to be alone with her thoughts in a motel room, with a lock that looked like it could be defeated by a determined toddler. The yard at that hour belonged to almost no one. A single motorcycle sat parked near the gate. Deacon, she recognized the custom paint job, and when she pulled in, he was already awake, sitting on an overturned crate with a cup of gas station coffee, watching the road. "You're here early," he said, not looking surprised. "Couldn't sleep." "Yeah." Deacon took a sip of his coffee. "Figured you might not after yesterday." Amber hesitated by her car door. "Were you out here all night?" "Somebody should be." The simplicity of it, no drama, no speech about loyalty or brotherhood, just a man drinking bad coffee at 5 in the morning, because he'd decided without being asked that she was worth losing sleep over, hit Amber harder than she expected. She had to look away, blinking fast, before he noticed. "You don't have to do that," she said finally. "I know." Deacon set the coffee down. "Doing it anyway." She let herself into the trailer without another word, because if she stayed in that conversation another 30 seconds, she was going to cry in front of a man she'd known. She'd known for 2.5 weeks, and she had promised herself driving into this town that she was done crying in front of people who could use it against her later. Except some quiet, unfamiliar part of her whispered that Deacon wasn't the kind of man who would. The work that morning consumed her the way it always did, a mercy, really the way numbers and dates and case files could swallow a mind that would otherwise spiral. She had cleared 4 filing cabinets in 3 weeks, built a cross-reference system on index cards, because the yard's computer was one hard crash away from complete failure, and organized 15 years of chaos into something that finally resembled order. But it was the 9th folder she pulled that morning, a thin one easy to overlook tucked behind a stack of receipts for scrap steel, that made her stop breathing for a full 3 seconds. Vehicle registration transfers. 6 of them, all processed in the same month 2 years ago, all bearing a county inspector's signature, she now recognized from the earlier discrepancies. Same inspector, same month, same irregular pattern of missing documentation. But this time there was something new. A secondary signature, smaller, almost hidden in the corner of each form. A notary stamp that, when she looked closer, had an expiration date that predated the transfers by 11 months. The notary seal had expired before it was ever used. Amber sat back slowly in her chair, her pulse picking up. This wasn't sloppy record-keeping anymore. Sloppy record-keeping didn't use an expired notary seal consistently, deliberately, across 6 separate transactions timed to coincide with a specific inspector's signature. This was someone building a paper trail designed to look legitimate to anyone who didn't look closely enough. Someone had been laundering vehicles through Steel Haven Salvage, using the yard's name, the yard's paperwork, the yard's legitimacy without the yard's knowledge. Her hands trembled as she photographed each document, with her phone cross-referencing dates against the intake logs she'd rebuilt from scratch. 6 vehicles, all high value before they'd been salvaged, all processed by the same inspector, all disappearing from official records within days of their paperwork being filed. She thought about Clay's instructions: sit on it, don't say anything yet, but this felt different from the first discovery. This felt like something with teeth. She found Clay in the main garage bay, elbow deep in the guts of a pickup truck engine, and she didn't wait for an opening. "I need you to see something." Clay looked up, saw her face, and immediately wiped his hands on a rag hanging from his belt. "What is it?" "It's not what I thought before. It's not clerical errors." She held out her phone, the photographs of the documents lined up in a gallery. "Someone's been using this yard's paperwork to launder stolen vehicles. Same inspector, expired notary seal, same 3-month window 2 years ago. 6 vehicles that I can find so far. There might be more." Clay took the phone, scrolling slowly through the images, his jaw tightening with each one. "You're sure about this?" "I've seen fraud before, Clay. I did the books for a real estate company for 2 years before I got..." She stopped herself, the old habit of protecting Nathan's name even now, even here. "Before I left. I know what deliberate looks like versus what sloppy looks like. This is deliberate." Behind Clay, a voice cut in, Big Sam, who had been listening from the next bay over, wrench still in hand. 2 years ago, that's around when old man Terrence ran the front office before his heart gave out." Clay's expression darkened. "Terrence never processed vehicle transfers. That wasn't his job. He handled scrap weight and customer intake. So who processed them? Amber asked. The silence that followed had weight to it. Clay looked at the photographs again, his thumb hovering over the screen, and Amber watched something shift in his face, the specific, focused stillness of a man recalculating everyone he trusted. I need names, Clay said finally, quiet and hard. Every signature on every document. Cross-reference it against payroll from that period. Today, before anybody else touches this. What are you thinking, Bum? Amber asked. Clay handed her a phone back, his eyes distant, working through something Amber couldn't see. I'm thinking somebody's been running a chop shop through my own paperwork under my own name, and I've been too busy keeping this club straight to notice a rat sitting in my own front office. He turned and walked toward the trailer without another word, and Amber hurried to keep up her mind, already racing through the implications. If someone inside Steel Haven had been complicit in vehicle fraud, that meant real legal exposure, not the vague threats in Nathan's lawyer's letter, but actual provable criminal liability that could shut the whole operation down if the wrong people found it first. And if Nathan's letter had arrived at almost the exact same moment she'd uncovered it, she stopped walking. Clay, he turned. What if this isn't a coincidence? What if whoever did this knows I've been going through the files and the letter from Nathan's lawyers isn't really about Nathan at all? What if it's a distraction to make everyone focus on me instead of what's actually buried in these cabinets? Clay's eyes narrowed, considering that. That's a hell of a theory. I've lived 4 years married to a man who used distraction as a weapon, Amber said. I know what it looks like when someone wants you looking one direction while something else happens behind you. Clay was quiet for a long moment, and then he nodded, slow and grim. Then we don't tell anybody outside this trailer what you found. Not yet. Not until I know who I'm dealing with. The next several days passed in a strange, taut quiet, the kind that settles over a place right before something breaks. Amber worked longer hours than she needed to, driven by something that had shifted inside her. Some old instinct waking back up after years of dormancy. She had been smart once, capable once, before Nathan had spent 4 years convincing her in small increments, so gradual she hadn't noticed the erosion happening, that she couldn't manage a checkbook without his oversight, couldn't be trusted with decisions, couldn't survive without him managing every corner of her life. She had believed him. That was the part that still made her furious late at night, staring at motel ceilings. She had actually believed him. But sitting in that trailer, cross-referencing payroll records against forged signatures, building a case with the same careful precision she'd once used to balance corporate books before Nathan decided that job was beneath his wife, Amber felt something return to her that she'd thought Nathan had permanently taken. Her own mind, sharp, capable, entirely her own. She found the name on a Thursday afternoon, buried in an old payroll ledger that had been handwritten before the yard switched to digital records. A former front office employee named Russ Corbin, who had worked at Steel Haven for 8 months, exactly 2 years ago, whose employment ended abruptly with no explanation in the file, and whose signature, when Amber laid it beside the forged transfer documents, matched in 3 distinct, unmistakable ways. She brought the ledger to Clay immediately, her heart hammering. Clay looked at the name for a long time without speaking. Then he said in a voice gone flat and cold, Russ Corbin. You know him? I fired him. Clay set the ledger down carefully like it might detonate. 8 months into the job, I caught him skimming cash off scrap sales. Didn't have proof solid enough to go to the KM, so I just cut him loose, told him if I ever saw his face on my property again, there'd be consequences. He looked up at Amber. I didn't know about vehicles. I didn't know he had access to transfer paperwork at all. Where is he now? Clay's expression turned grim. That, he said, is exactly what I intend to find out. What Amber didn't know, what she wouldn't learn for another several days, though the pieces would eventually click together with sickening clarity, was that Russ Corbin had not simply drifted away after being fired from Steel Haven. He had found new employment almost immediately in a role that gave him access to something far more dangerous than scrapyard paperwork. He had gone to work for a private investigation firm, specifically the firm currently under contract to Nathan Mercer. Grissom, the investigator, who had sat across from Nathan's desk delivering updates in his flat professional voice, had hired Corbin 6 months ago as a subcontractor, a man with local knowledge, local connections, someone who knew which doors in this part of the state opened easiest with a little cash. Corbin hadn't known at first that the woman his new employer was hunting had ended up working at the exact scrapyard where his old fraud scheme was buried in a filing cabinet. When he found out through a casual mention from Grissom, a physical description that matched too closely to be coincidence, he had felt something close to panic. Because if Amber Collins started digging through Steelhaven's records with the kind of thoroughness Grissom's briefing had described, she wouldn't just find evidence of a marriage gone wrong, she would find him. Amber didn't know any of this yet. What she knew on that Thursday evening was that Clay had gone quiet and hard in a way she hadn't seen before, making calls in his office with the door shut, his voice a low murmur she couldn't decipher through the walls. She was gathering her things to leave for the night when Rosa appeared in the trailer doorway, her expression uncharacteristically serious. "You should probably head out the back way tonight," Rosa said. Amber's stomach tightened. "Why?" "Sedan's back. Different plates again, but Deacon clocked the same scratch on the front bumper from 3 weeks ago. It's parked about a quarter-mile down Route 9, just sitting there." Rosa's voice was steady, but her eyes carried real worry. "Clay wants you staying at the yard tonight. There's a cot in the back office. Nobody's going to bother you here." "I can't just—" "You can and you will," Rosa said in a tone that brooked no argument. "This isn't up for debate, Amber, not tonight." Amber's hands had started shaking again, the old familiar fear rising up her spine like cold water. She thought about the sedan, about Nathan's messages, about the letter sitting in Clay's desk drawer, about a private investigator's photograph of her license plate outside a gas station in Kentucky. He was close. She could feel it now, the way you feel a storm coming before the sky changes color. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay, I'll stay." The cot in the back office was thin, and the blanket smelled like motor oil, but Amber found strangely that she slept better there than she had in the motel in weeks. Maybe it was the sound of Deacon's motorcycle idling near the gate through most of the night. Maybe it was knowing that Big Sam had positioned himself in the garage bay closest to the road, ostensibly working a night shift on an engine rebuild that Amber suspected didn't actually need to be done that night. Maybe it was simply the accumulated weight of 3 weeks spent among people who had decided without asking anything in return that she was worth protecting. She woke before dawn to the sound of raised voices outside. Her heart lurched into her throat as she scrambled off the cot, pulling on her shoes, moving toward the office window with her pulse hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. Through the gap in the blinds, she saw Clay standing near the front gate, along with 4 other members of the club she recognized by now. Deacon Big Sam, a lean, quiet man named Tucker, who ran the crane, and an older biker named Frank, who mostly kept to himself doing engine work. Standing opposite them on the other side of the gate was a man in a gray suit that cost more than everything Amber currently owned combined. Her stomach dropped through the floor. It wasn't Nathan. She recognized the face after a moment of disorienting panic. It was one of Nathan's lawyers, a younger associate named Whitfield, who had handled some of the earlier legal filings during the divorce that Nathan had dragged out for over a year, weaponizing every possible delay. Have every right to be on this property," Whitfield was saying, in his voice carrying the particular smugness of a man who had never once in his entire life faced consequences he couldn't buy his way out of. "I'm simply here to deliver formal notice." "You delivered your notice by mail," Clay said, his voice a low rumble that carried easily across the yard's morning quiet. "This is my property. You're trespassing." "I have every legal right." "You have the right to leave," Clay interrupted, "before I decide you don't." Amber pressed her hand against her mouth, watching through the blinds, torn between the instinct to hide and the fierce, unfamiliar urge to walk out there and face this herself. Whitfield's eyes swept past Clay, scanning the property, and for one heart-stopping second, Amber was certain he'd seen her silhouette in the office window. But his gaze kept moving, landing instead on the trailer where she'd spent the last 3 weeks rebuilding 15 years of chaos into order. "My client has reason to believe his wife is being harbored on this property," Whitfield said. "Interfering with a legal marital dispute carries significant liability for ex-wife," Clay corrected, his voice gone hard as steel. "And I don't know what you think you're going to find here, counselor, but I'd suggest you get back in whatever car brought you and drive it back to wherever it came from." "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact," Clay said. "Same as the fact that this conversation is being recorded." He gestured almost lazily toward a small camera mounted above the gate that Amber hadn't noticed before. Same as the fact that if you or anybody working for your client sets foot on this property again without a warrant, you'll be talking to my lawyer instead of me. And trust me, you don't want that conversation. Whitfield's composure flickered just slightly, the first genuine crack Amber had seen. He hadn't expected resistance this organized, this calm. He'd expected what intimidation to work the way it usually did on people who didn't have resources of their own. "This isn't over," Whitfield said, finally retreating toward a black sedan parked at the curb, the same sedan Amber realized with a fresh wave of nausea that had been circling for weeks. "Didn't figure it would be," Clay said. "Tell your client something for me." Whitfield paused, hand on the car door. "Tell him this yard doesn't scare, and neither does the woman he's looking for," Clay said. "Tell him whatever he thinks he's owed here, he's not getting it. Not while she's standing on this property." The sedan pulled away, and Amber remained frozen at the window for a long moment after it disappeared from view, her whole body trembling with adrenaline she didn't know how to release. When Clay walked into the back office 10 minutes later, she was still standing there, arms wrapped around herself. "You heard all that?" he asked. "Every word." Clay's expression softened just slightly, the closest thing to gentleness Amber had seen from him. "He's testing boundaries, sending lawyers because he thinks paperwork scares people like us." A dry, humorless smile crossed his face. "He's about to learn how wrong he is." "Clay, I need to know something." Amber's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Is this going to get worse before it gets better?" Clay didn't sugarcoat it, and she found strangely that she was grateful for that. "Probably," he admitted. "Men like him don't stop because you say no. They stop when saying no stops working for them, when the cost outweighs whatever they think they're entitled to." He studied her for a moment. "But you're not facing that alone anymore. Whatever he throws at you, he's throwing at this whole club now too." Amber didn't trust her voice, so she just nodded, blinking hard against the sudden burn behind her eyes. 2 days later, the second twist arrived, and it came from a direction nobody at Steelhaven had anticipated. It started with a phone call to the front office, not from a lawyer this time, but from the county's Regulatory Compliance Division, informing Clay that Steelhaven Salvage was scheduled for an emergency inspection the following week due to multiple citizen complaints regarding environmental and licensing violations. Clay hung up the phone slowly, his expression unreadable, and relayed the news to Amber and Rosa in the trailer. "We've never had a complaint filed against us," Rosa said immediately, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Not in 11 years. Clay runs this place cleaner than half the yards in the county." "Somebody filed complaints anyway," Clay said grimly. "Multiple ones, apparently. Enough to trigger an emergency inspection instead of the usual scheduled kind." Amber felt something cold settle in her stomach. "This is him. We don't know that." "Clay, think about the timing." Amber pressed her mind, already racing through the pattern, the same instinct that had caught the fraud in the files, now firing on something far more immediate and dangerous. Letter from his lawyers, then a lawyer physically showing up, and now suddenly citizen complaints triggering an emergency inspection, all within 2 weeks of him finding out where I am. This isn't a coincidence. This is exactly what a man like Nathan does. He doesn't come at you directly. He uses institutions, regulations, paperwork. He weaponizes bureaucracy because it's legal and it's slow and it's exhausting, and by the time anyone realizes what's happening, the damage is already done. Clay's jaw tightened as the pieces clicked into place. "He's trying to shut down the yard. He's trying to make it too expensive to keep me here," Amber said. "If Steelhaven gets hit with violations, fines, maybe even a shutdown order, that's pressure on you, on everyone here, because of me. That's exactly how he operates. He doesn't threaten you directly. He threatens everything around you until you're the one who has to make the hard choice." The trailer went silent for a long moment. Rosa looked between Amber and Clay, her expression tight with worry. "So what do we do?" Rosa finally asked. Clay's eyes moved to the growing stack of files Amber had organized over the past 3 weeks. The fraud documentation, the forged signatures, the evidence connecting Russ Corbin to 6 laundered vehicles processed under Steelhaven's name. "We make sure," Clay said slowly, "that when those inspectors walk through that gate, they find a business that's cleaner than clean. And we make sure Amber's the one standing next to me when they do, because if this county sends actual inspectors instead of somebody's hired flunky, they're going to find real records, real documentation, and real proof that whatever complaints got filed are garbage." "And if it's not real inspectors," Amber asked quietly, What if it's someone Nathan's paid off? What if the paperwork's forged before they even walk through the gate? Clay's eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. Then you're gonna catch it. Same way you caught everything else in this trailer that everybody else missed for 15 years. The weight of that responsibility settled onto Amber's shoulders, heavy and terrifying, and somewhere underneath the fear, strangely exhilarating. For 4 years, she had been told she wasn't capable of managing anything more complicated than a grocery list. Now, a man who had built a business and led a motorcycle club for 2 decades was telling her that the entire future of Steel Haven Salvage might rest on her ability to spot a lie in a stack of government paperwork. "I won't let you down," she said. "I know you won't," Clay said. "That's exactly why I'm not worried." Sorry. The week that followed was a blur of frantic, focused preparation. Amber worked from before sunrise until well after dark, pulling every environmental compliance document Steel Haven had filed over the past decade, cross-referencing permit numbers, verifying disposal certifications, building an ironclad paper trail that would make any legitimate inspection walk away with nothing to find. Rosa helped where she could, though her strength lay more in customer relations than paperwork, and mostly she kept Amber fed and hydrated through days that stretched 12 by 14 hours long. Deacon and Big Sam handled the physical side of things, going through the yard, bay by bay, to ensure every piece of equipment met code, every hazardous material was properly stored and labeled, every fire extinguisher current and accessible. Clay oversaw everything with the quiet, relentless focus of a man who had survived worse threats than a corrupt inspection and intended to survive this one too. But it was on the 4th night of preparation, well past midnight, both of them alone in the trailer, surrounded by mountains of paper, that Amber found the piece that changed everything. "Clay." Her voice was barely a whisper, but something in its tone made him look up immediately from the folder he'd been reviewing. "Look at this." She held out a printed document, an environmental compliance filing from 18 months ago, one of the routine inspection reports the county required annually. "That's a standard filing," Clay said. "We pass those every year." "Look at the form number," Amber said, pointing to a small code printed in the corner. "This form was discontinued by the state 2 years ago. They switched to a completely new compliance format after an audit revealed the old forms had a loophole that let businesses falsify disposal weights." Clay's eyes narrowed. "You're saying this is fake?" "I'm saying somebody used an outdated, discontinued form to file this," Amber said, her pulse quickening as the pattern crystallized in her mind. "Which means either our previous inspector was using paperwork they should have known was obsolete, which is sloppy but possible, or somebody deliberately used an old form because it was easier to manipulate." Same signature as before. Amber flipped through the pages, comparing handwriting, her hands moving with a speed and confidence that surprised even her. "No, different inspector this time. But look," she pulled out another document, laying it beside the first. "Same discontinued form, filed for the same property 6 months apart by 2 different inspectors who supposedly didn't know each other." Clay stared at the documents for a long moment, and then something dark and furious moved behind his eyes. "You're telling me somebody's been running 2 separate schemes through my paperwork? Vehicle fraud 2 years ago, environmental filing fraud within the last 18 months. I'm telling you," Amber said slowly, the full weight of the realization settling over her, "that if the same corrupt paperwork is what triggers these county inspectors next week, and if whoever's coming to inspect this yard is using the same discontinued forms as evidence, then it's not a real inspection," Clay finished grimly. "It's a setup." The trailer fell into heavy silence, broken only by the distant hum of the yard's security lights and the low growl of Deacon's motorcycle idling somewhere near the gate. "We need to know who's coming," Amber said finally. "Not just what department. Names, badge numbers, everything before they walk through that gate." Clay was already reaching for his phone. "I know somebody at the county office. Old friend does maintenance on his truck here every year, no charge on account of some trouble I helped him out of a long time back." He dialed, his voice dropping into the low, patient tone Amber had learned meant he was calling in a favor that mattered. "Pete, it's Clay. Need a favor and I need it quiet." Amber listened to half a conversation she couldn't fully follow, watching Clay's expression shift through concentration, then surprise, then something colder and harder than she'd seen from him yet. He hung up and turned to her slowly. "The inspection scheduled for next week isn't coming from the regular county compliance office. Clay said. It's a special task force apparently formed 6 weeks ago to investigate irregular salvage operations in this district, funded through a state grant. He paused, letting the next part land with deliberate weight. A grant application submitted and approved through the sponsorship of Mercer Holdings. Amber's blood went cold. He didn't just file a complaint, she whispered. He built an entire task force. He funded it himself, gave it just enough legitimate cover that nobody would think to question where the money came from, and now he's sending it straight through your front gate. Looks that way, Clay said grimly. Clay, this isn't just about scaring me anymore. Amber's hands had started shaking, the old fear rising up alongside something new, a fierce protective fury on behalf of people who had done nothing except open a gate for a stranger Aussie with $40 and nowhere else to go. This is about destroying this place, whatever it costs him. He'd rather burn Steel Haven to the ground than let me have somewhere safe to stand. Clay's jaw tightened, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something low and absolutely certain. Then he's about to find out. He said that this yard was built by men who've survived worse than money. And he's about to find out that the woman he thinks he's hunting just spent 3 weeks becoming the sharpest set of eyes this county's seen in years. He looked at the mountain of documentation spread across the desk between them. The forged signatures, the discontinued forms, the fraud that stretched back years, all of it now converging into a single undeniable pattern that pointed toward a conspiracy far larger than either of them had first suspected. Next week, Clay said, when that task force walks through my gate thinking they're going to find violations to shut me down, they're going to find something else instead. Amber finished, a steely resolve settling into her voice that surprised her with its own strength. What's that? The truth, Amber said. All of it, laid out so clearly that no amount of his money is going to be able to bury it again. Outside, the yard's security lights flickered against the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a motorcycle engine turned over and settled into a low, steady, idle deacon, keeping watch the way he had every night since the sedan first appeared. Amber gathered the documents into careful, methodical order, her mind already racing ahead to the work still needed before the task force arrived, verifying every date, tracing every falsified signature back to its source, building a case so airtight that even a task force bought and paid for by Nathan Mercer's money wouldn't be able to twist the truth into something it wasn't. She had walked through that gate 3 weeks ago, carrying nothing but fear, and $40 certain she was disappearing into the one place her old life would never think to look. She hadn't expected to find something worth fighting for. She hadn't expected to become someone capable of fighting for it. But sitting there in the quiet hum of the trailer at 2 a.m, surrounded by evidence of a lie that stretched back years, flanked by a man who had decided without hesitation that her safety was worth risking his own business for, Amber Collins felt something settle into place inside her that Nathan Mercer had spent 4 years trying to convince her didn't exist. Her own strength, untouched and entirely her own. Whatever walked through that gate next week, she would be ready for it. The task force arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after Clay's phone call to his contact at the county office, and Amber had not slept more than 4 hours a night in any of those 6 days. She didn't feel the exhaustion, though. Not really. Something had taken over in her chest that burned hotter than fatigue, a focus so total it felt almost like the adrenaline Nathan used to trigger in her, except this time it didn't come from fear. It came from purpose. By the time the 2 black SUVs pulled through Steel Haven's front gate at 9 a.m, Amber had built a binder 3 inches thick. Every discrepancy cross-referenced. Every forged signature laid beside its legitimate counterpart. Every discontinued form flagged with the exact date the state had retired it, printed straight from the state regulatory website, time-stamped, notarized by an actual notary whose seal Amber had personally verified was current. She stood beside Clay at the office trailer's front steps, her hands folded in front of her to keep them from shaking, and watched 4 people climb out of the SUVs. 3 of them wore county badges and carried clipboards with the practiced boredom of people who did this every week. The 4th wore a suit that did not belong in a scrapyard pressed expensive, the kind of gray that only existed in a wardrobe built by someone with more money than taste. That's not county, Clay murmured under his breath. No, Amber agreed. That's a lawyer. The lead inspector, a heavy-set man named Halloran with a county badge and a clipboard, approached first, his expression carrying the particular self-importance of a low-level official who had suddenly been handed authority over something bigger than his usual jurisdiction. Steel Haven Salvage, Halloran said, consulting his clipboard without looking up. We're here regarding multiple citizen complaints of environmental violations, improper disposal documentation, and unlicensed vehicle processing. This is a mandatory compliance inspection under emergency provisions. Good morning to you too, Clay said, his voice flat and unimpressed. You got names on those complaints, or is that confidential? Complainant information is protected. Convenient, Clay said. Halloran's jaw tightened. I'll need access to your full facility, your disposal logs, vehicle, intake records for the past 3 years, and any environmental compliance filings on record. Everything you need is right here, Amber said, stepping forward before Clay could respond, holding out the 3-inch binder with both hands. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Organized by year, cross-referenced by document type. I'd be happy to walk you through anything you need clarified. Halloran blinked clearly, not expecting this level of preparation from a scrapyard that 6 citizen complaints filed, Amber, now suspected by people who didn't exist, had painted as a lawless dumping ground. He took the binder, slowly flipping through the first few pages with a frown that suggested he wasn't sure what to make of what he was seeing. That was when the man in the gray suit stepped forward. Actually, he said, his voice smooth in the particular way of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his convenience. Before the inspection proceeds, there's a separate matter I need to address. My name is Whitfield. I represent Nathan Mercer. Amber's stomach dropped. She hadn't expected him here physically standing on this property again after Clay had all but thrown him off it 2 weeks ago. You're trespassing, Clay said immediately, his voice gone hard. I'm accompanying a county-sanctioned inspection, Whitfield corrected smoothly. Entirely legal. And I have separate legal documents to serve to Mrs. Mercer, who I understand is employed on this property. There's no Mrs. Mercer here, Amber said, and her voice, to her own surprise, didn't waver. My name is Amber Collins. The court records reflect a marriage that ended the night I left, Amber said. You can call me whatever you want, Mr. Whitfield. It doesn't change who signs my paychecks now, and it doesn't change whose property you are currently trespassing on while pretending to be part of a government inspection. Something flickered across Whitfield's face. Surprise, maybe at the steadiness in her voice, or irritation that his usual tactics weren't landing the way they typically did. He recovered quickly, sliding a manila envelope from his briefcase. These are formal documents regarding the financial settlement my client believes you're obligated to honor, he said, as well as a restraining request related to what my client characterizes as your abandonment of shared marital assets. Clay's hand came down on the envelope before Amber could reach for it, stopping Whitfield cold. She's not taking anything from you today, Clay said. You want to serve legal papers, you do it through her actual attorney, not by ambushing her during a business inspection you clearly arranged yourself. I have no idea what you're implying, Whitfield said, his composure sharpening into something colder. Sure you don't, Clay said. Halloran, still flipping through Amber's binder with a growing frown, looked up between the two men with obvious confusion. Is there a problem here? Because I was told this was a straightforward compliance issue. There's no problem, Whitfield said quickly. Just a separate civil matter that happens to intersect with today's proceedings. It's not separate, Amber said, and something in her voice made everyone in the small group turn toward her. It's the same matter, Inspector Halloran. The same man who's trying to serve me legal papers right now is the same man whose company sponsored the state grant that funded this task force. I'd be very curious whether you knew that when you accepted this assignment. The silence that followed was absolute. Halloran's eyes moved slowly from Amber to Whitfield, something calculating and uneasy crossing his face. That's a serious accusation. It's not an accusation, Amber said, reaching into the folder she'd been holding separately from the main binder, the one she and Clay had prepared specifically for this moment. It's public record. Mercer Holdings' name is listed as the primary sponsor on the grant application that created your task force 6 weeks ago. I pulled it from the state database 3 days ago. She held out a printed copy, the state seal clearly visible at the top. The timing lines up exactly with when Mr. Mercer's legal team located me at this address. Halloran took the paper with visibly shaking hands, scanning it once. Then again, his expression shifting from professional detachment to something closer to alarm. This says nothing illegal happened, Whitfield interjected quickly. Private citizens and companies fund public initiatives all the time. There's nothing improper about There's nothing improper about a state grant, Amber agreed. There's something very improper about using that grant to send an investigative task force to harass a private business, specifically to pressure an employee who happens to be your client's ex-wife. That's not compliance enforcement, Mr. Whitfield. That's targeted retaliation dressed up in a government badge. One of the other county inspectors, a younger woman who had stayed quiet until now, cleared her throat uncomfortably. Sir, if this task force was funded specifically to target a single property connected to a personal dispute that could constitute misuse of state funds, we'd need to report that up the chain before continuing. There is no personal dispute affecting this inspection, Whitfield said, his voice climbing half a register, the first real crack in his composure. This is an entirely legitimate. Then you won't mind, Clay interrupted. If Amber shows you exactly why every complaint filed against this yard doesn't hold up. He nodded toward her, and Amber opened the second folder, the one containing the discontinued forms, the forged notary seals, the 6 laundered vehicles, everything she and Clay had spent 6 sleepless nights assembling into an argument so complete it could not be dismissed as coincidence. Inspector Halloran, she said, laying the documents out one by one on the hood of the nearest truck. These are the environmental compliance forms your task force is likely planning to cite as evidence of violations. I'd like you to look at the form numbers in the corner of each page. Halloran leaned down, scanning the numbers with a frown. These forms were discontinued by the state 2 years ago, Amber continued, replaced after an audit revealed a loophole that allowed businesses to falsify disposal weights. If your complaints reference these forms as current documentation, then whoever filed those complaints either doesn't know current state regulations, unlikely for a professional task force, or they deliberately use outdated forms because they knew exactly what loophole they were exploiting. That's speculation, Whitfield said, but his voice had lost its earlier smoothness. It's not speculation, Amber said, pulling out the final piece, the one she and Clay had confirmed only 2 nights ago after Clay's contact had quietly pulled additional records. Because these same discontinued forms were used 18 months ago to falsify environmental filings under this yard's name, filed by an inspector who no longer works for the county, cross-referenced with vehicle fraud dating back 2 years. Tied to a former Steel Haven employee named Russ Corbin, who currently works as a subcontractor for the private investigation firm your client hired to locate me. The silence this time had a different quality to it. Heavier. Halloran's face had gone pale, and the 2 junior inspectors exchanged a look that suggested they were beginning to understand they'd been sent into something far more complicated than a routine compliance check. You're telling me, Halloran said slowly, that the complaints that triggered this task force were fabricated using paperwork connected to actual fraud committed against this business, and that fraud is connected to the man standing right next to me. That's exactly what I'm telling you, Amber said, and I have 3 weeks of documentation to prove every part of it. Whitfield's face had gone rigid, his earlier confidence entirely drained away. This is outrageous. My client is a respected member of this community, and these baseless accusations are not baseless, Clay said, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous. They're sitting on the hood of that truck in black and white, counselor. And unless you want your name attached to obstruction of a state fraud investigation, I'd suggest you get back in whatever car brought you here. Whitfield opened his mouth to respond, and that was the exact moment a third vehicle pulled through Steel Haven's front gate, a sleek black car that didn't belong anywhere near a scrapyard, moving slowly, deliberately, until it stopped a few yards from the gathered group. Amber's blood turned to ice the moment the door opened. Nathan Mercer stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks with the casual, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his life believed a room wouldn't eventually bend to his will. He looked exactly like she remembered expensive, controlled, handsome, in the practiced way of a man who spent significant money maintaining the appearance of effortlessness. His eyes found her immediately, and something in his expression shifted satisfaction, mixed with something colder underneath. Amber, he said, his voice carrying that same smooth, patient tone he'd always used right before things got worse. You look tired. I imagine running takes a lot out of a person. Every muscle in Amber's body went rigid. 4 years of instinct screamed at her to shrink, to soften her voice, to find the version of herself that had learned exactly how to navigate his moods to minimize the damage. Her hands wanted to shake. Her throat wanted to close. She forced herself to stand still. "Nathan," she said, and was almost surprised by how flat and unafraid her own voice sounded. "You shouldn't be here." "I have every right to be here," Nathan said, stepping closer, ignoring the 4 men flanking Clay, who had gone rigid and alert the moment his car pulled through the gate. "You're my wife. You left our home, our marriage, our life together without so much as a conversation. I've spent 5 months and considerable resources trying to understand why. I think I've earned the right to at least look you in the eye." "We're divorced, Nathan." "The papers haven't finalized," Nathan said smoothly. "You know that. There are financial matters still unresolved. Assets you walked away from that legally belong to both of us. I simply want what's fair." "You want control," Amber said, and this time her voice carried an edge she hadn't allowed herself in 4 years. "You've always wanted control, Nathan. You just called it fairness because it sounds better in front of an audience." Something flickered across Nathan's face, irritation. Maybe at the audience itself, at Clay and Deacon, and Big Sam standing there watching at Halloran and his clipboard at the entire scene unfolding in a way he clearly hadn't scripted. "I don't think this is the time or place," Nathan said, his voice tightening slightly. "You made it the time and place," Amber said. "You funded a task force. You sent your lawyer to serve me papers during a business inspection. You had someone circling this property in a sedan for 3 weeks. You did all of that, Nathan, not me." "I did what any husband would do to protect his family," Nathan said, and for the first time something raw slipped through his controlled exterior. Real anger close to the surface. "You disappeared. You took nothing, said nothing, left me to explain to everyone we knew why my wife vanished in the middle of the night like a criminal." "I left in the middle of the night," Amber said, her voice shaking now, but not with fear, with something closer to fury finally given permission to surface. "Because the last time I tried to leave during the day, you broke my wrist, convincing me to stay." The words landed like a physical blow across the entire gathered group. Halloran's pen stopped moving. The younger inspector's eyes widened. Deacon's hands curled slowly into fists at his sides, and Clay went very, very still. The particular stillness of a man exercising enormous restraint. Nathan's face had gone pale, his composure cracking for the first time. That was an accident. You fell. "I know exactly what happened," Amber said. "I have the emergency room records to prove it, Nathan. Records I kept quietly for 4 years because some part of me always knew that someday I might need them. I never wanted to use them. I just wanted to be free of you." Her voice steadied, gaining strength with every word. "But you didn't let me have that, did you? You had to keep hunting. You had to keep proving that I couldn't survive without you. So congratulations, Nathan. You've proven the opposite. I survived. I built something here. And now you've dragged your own fraud into the daylight, trying to destroy it." "My fraud?" Nathan's voice climbed, real panic bleeding through now. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Russ Corbin," Amber said. "Your investigator subcontractor. Former Steel Haven employee fired for skimming cash who happens to have his signature on 6 forged vehicle transfers processed through this yard's paperwork 2 years ago, and on falsified environmental filings 18 months ago that conveniently used discontinued state forms, the exact same forms your task force's complaints are built around." Nathan's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since Amber had known him, she watched him search for words and find nothing. "You didn't just want to find me." Amber continued, her voice ringing clear across the yard, now loud enough that even the county inspector standing several yards back could hear every word. "You wanted to bury this business so completely that I'd have nowhere left to go except back to you. You used a man who already had a history of fraud against this yard, gave him resources and motive, and let him run a scheme that had nothing to do with finding me and everything to do with destroying the one place that gave me somewhere to stand." "This is insane," Nathan said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence, replaced by something brittle and defensive. "You're grasping at conspiracy theories because you can't accept—" "Inspector Halloran," Amber said, turning deliberately away from Nathan and toward the county official, whose face had gone from pale to genuinely alarmed. "I'd like to formally request that everything discussed here today be documented as part of your official report. including Mr. Mercer's presence, his connection to the grant funding your task force, and his connection through his investigation firm to Russ Corbin, whose fraudulent paperwork appears to be the basis for the complaints against this business. Halloran looked between Amber Clay and Nathan, and something settled in his expression. The look of a man who had just realized he'd been used as a weapon in someone else's war and who did not appreciate the discovery. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I think we need to pause this inspection entirely and escalate this to the State Fraud Division. What you're describing isn't a compliance issue. It's potential criminal conspiracy misuse of public funds and possibly witness intimidation." "No," Nathan said sharply, stepping forward. "This inspection needs to proceed as scheduled. There are legitimate violations at this property that—" Sir Halloran interrupted, his voice suddenly firm in a way it hadn't been all morning. "I'd strongly advise you to leave this property immediately. Given what's just been presented, your continued presence could be construed as interference with a state investigation." Nathan's face contorted with a fury he could no longer disguise, the mask finally slipping entirely to reveal something ugly underneath the same expression Amber realized with a chill that had preceded every worst moment of their marriage. "You think this changes anything?" Nathan said, rounding on Amber, his voice low and venomous, now that the polished veneer had cracked. "You think hiding behind a bunch of criminals in leather vests makes you safe? You'll always be looking over your shoulder, Amber. Every single day. I have resources you can't even imagine. I have patience you can't outlast." "Nathan," Clay's voice cut through the tension like a blade, quiet and absolutely final. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Nathan and Amber without seeming to hurry his presence alone enough to make Nathan take an involuntary step back. "You've said your piece, now you're going to get back in your car and you're going to leave this property. And if I ever see you or anyone connected to you within a mile of this yard again, the conversation we have won't involve lawyers or inspectors or paperwork." "Is that a threat?" Nathan said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier bravado. "It's a promise," Clay said. "Same as the promise I made to Amber the day she walked through that gate. Nobody touches her. Nobody threatens her. Nobody so much as raises their voice at her on this property or anywhere near the people who work here. You want to test that promise, you're welcome to try." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Nathan's eyes flicked across the gathered group, Clay immovable in front of him, Deacon and Big Sam flanking either side, with expressions carved from Stonedocker and Frank, having appeared at some point during the confrontation, standing at the edges of the yard like a wall nobody had invited him to test. Something in Nathan's calculation finally shifted. Amber watched it happen in real time the moment a man who had spent his entire life getting his way through money and pressure and quiet, patient cruelty realized for possibly the first time that none of those tools worked here. "This isn't finished," Nathan said, but the words came out weaker than he clearly intended, already retreating toward his car. "It is for you," Amber said quietly, and something in her own voice surprised her, not triumph exactly, but a kind of exhausted, hard-won clarity. "You don't get to control this anymore, Nathan. Any of it. Not me, not this place, not what happens next." He didn't respond. He got into his car, and Whitfield scrambled after him, and the black sedan pulled through Steel Haven's gate and disappeared down the road, taking with it 4 years of fear that had followed Amber every single day since the night she'd finally found the courage to leave. Amber stood frozen for a long moment after the car vanished, her whole body trembling with the release of adrenaline that had kept her upright through the entire confrontation. Clay's hand landed gently on her shoulder. Not possessive, not demanding, just steady grounding. "You okay?" "I don't know yet," Amber admitted, her voice shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "Ask me again in an hour." Halloran approached slowly, his earlier officiousness entirely replaced by something more careful, almost apologetic. "Ms. Collins, I owe you an apology. I had no idea the complaints against this property were connected to something like this. I'll be filing a full report to the State Fraud Division today, and I suspect this task force will be dissolved before the week is out." "Thank you," Amber said. "You should also know," Halloran added, glancing toward the departed sedan's dust, still settling on the road, "that misuse of state grant funds is a serious criminal matter. Depending on what the Fraud Division finds, Mr. Mercer could be looking at charges that go well beyond a simple civil dispute." Something in Amber's chest loosened just slightly for the first time in 5 months. The days that followed moved differently than any Amber had experienced since arriving at Steel Haven. Not calmer exactly because the state fraud division's involvement brought its own flurry of interviews, statements, and document requests. But there was a different quality to the exhaustion now. It felt earned instead of imposed. It felt like the aftermath of a fight she had chosen to have, rather than one that had simply happened to her. Russ Corbin was arrested 11 days later, picked up at a motel 2 counties over. And within 48 hours of his arrest, he had begun cooperating with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, a decision that unraveled the entire scheme with startling speed. He confirmed everything Amber had suspected. Grissom Nathan's investigator had connected him to the fraud years before Amber had ever arrived at Steel. Haven had known about the vehicle laundering scheme from the start, and had seen an opportunity once Amber's location was confirmed to weaponize Corbin's existing access to bury the yard in manufactured violations. Nathan's name appeared in the state's official complaint 3 weeks after that. Not as a primary target, his lawyers had clearly worked overtime to insulate him from direct criminal liability, but as a person of interest in the misuse of grant funding, facing a civil investigation that would likely cost him significantly more in legal fees and reputation than he had ever intended to spend chasing his ex-wife across state lines. It wasn't a total victory. Amber understood that. Men like Nathan rarely faced the full consequences their actions deserved. Money bought too many buffers, too many delays, too many lawyers willing to trade technicalities for time. But it was enough. It was more than enough. He would spend the next several years fighting battles of his own making instead of hunting her. And for the first time since she'd driven away from their house with nothing but a duffel bag, Amber allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't involve looking over her shoulder. Clay found her in the trailer on a quiet Thursday evening. The fraud investigation's paperwork finally slowing to a manageable trickle, the yard settling back into its familiar rhythm of grinding metal and low-engine growls. "You did good," he said, leaning in the doorway. "We did good," Amber corrected. "I couldn't have gotten through any of this without you. Without all of you." Clay considered that for a moment, his eyes moving across the trailer, transformed now. 3 months later, from a disaster of forgotten paperwork into an organized, functioning office that ran more efficiently than the yard had in over a decade. "You know," he said slowly, "when you walked through that gate with $40 and a backpack, I figured I was giving a scared woman somewhere to hide for a few weeks before she moved on to the next town." "I remember." "I was wrong," Clay said. "You weren't hiding. You were just waiting for somewhere solid enough to stand and forward from." He paused, something almost like pride crossing his weathered face. "This yard's never had anybody like you running these records. Never had anybody catch fraud that ran this deep, this far back. Half the reason we survived that task force scam was because you'd already built a case nobody could argue with." Amber felt something warm rise in her chest, unfamiliar. After years of being told in 100 small and devastating ways that she was a burden rather than an asset. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, Clay said that Friday deadline expired about 10 weeks ago, and I never got around to telling you the job's permanent." He held out his hand, the same gesture he'd offered the day she first walked through the gate, except this time it meant something entirely different. "Been meaning to make it official. Been putting it off because some part of me figured you'd want to leave once the danger passed. Start fresh somewhere. Nathan Mercer's name doesn't mean anything." Amber looked around the trailer, organized, purposeful, hers in every sense that mattered, and then out the window toward the yard where Deacon was laughing at something Big Sam had said, where Rosa was locking up the front counter for the night, where a community of people she had known for barely 3 months had become, without her fully realizing when it happened, something that felt dangerously close to family. "I don't want to leave," she said quietly. "I want to stay. If you'll have me." "Wasn't really a question," Clay said, a rare smile breaking across his weathered face. "Was more of a formality." Amber laughed, a real laugh, the first one in longer than she could remember. One that came from somewhere deep and unguarded. Somewhere Nathan had spent 4 years trying to close off entirely. She had walked through that gate 3 months ago, believing she was choosing the last resort. The place nobody wanted, the job nobody else would take, the desperate final option for a woman with nothing left to lose. She hadn't understood, not then, that she was walking into exactly the opposite. She had been choosing herself. And somewhere behind her, 40 miles away, in an office that suddenly felt considerably less secure than it had 3 months earlier, Nathan Mercer sat alone with a stack of legal bills and a silence that no amount of money had ever been able to fill. The permanent job offer came on a Thursday. By the following Monday, Amber's world had already tilted sideways again. It started with a phone call Clay took in his office door. Shut. Voice dropping into that low-controlled register Amber had learned to recognize as trouble. She was 2 files deep into a routine intake log when Rosa appeared in the trailer doorway, arms crossed, worry etched into every line of her face. "Clay wants you in his office," Rosa said. "Now." Amber's stomach dropped before she even stood up. 3 months at Steel Haven had taught her to read urgency in the smallest signals, the tightness around Rosa's mouth, the way she wouldn't quite meet Amber's eyes. "Is it Nathan?" "I don't know," Rosa admitted, "but whatever it is, Clay's face went white halfway through that call, and I've never seen Clay's face go white for anything." Amber's legs felt unsteady, walking across the yard past Deacon, working on a bike he'd stripped down to nothing past Big Sam, hauling a transmission out of a rusted-out sedan, all of it suddenly feeling fragile, temporary, like a life she'd only been borrowing. Clay was standing behind his desk when she walked in, phone still in his hand, his expression unreadable in a way that frightened her more than open anger would have. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." Clay studied her for a moment, then nodded, respecting the refusal. "That was the County Fraud Division. Follow up on Corbin's cooperation deal." He set the phone down slowly. "They found something in his financial records. Wire transfers going back almost 3 years. Money moving from an account tied to Mercer Holdings into a shell company Corbin controlled." "That's not surprising," Amber said carefully. "We already knew Nathan funded." "The dates don't match what we thought," Clay interrupted. "The first transfer was made 3 years ago, a full year before I ever fired Corbin for skimming cash." He paused, letting that land. "Which means Nathan wasn't just using an already corrupt employee to launder vehicles 2 years back. He planted Corbin here, before you ever left your marriage, before any of this started." Amber felt the floor shift beneath her. "That doesn't make sense. Why would he plant someone at a random scrapyard 3 years ago? He didn't even know I'd end up here." "I didn't know I'd end up here." Clay's jaw tightened. "That's what's got me worried. Fraud Division thinks Steel Haven wasn't random at all. They think Corbin was planted here specifically because of something else Mercer Holdings was already running through this region, separate from you entirely. Money laundering infrastructure built years before you ever walked through that gate." The room went very quiet. Amber's mind raced backward through everything she thought she understood about the last 3 months, the fraud she'd uncovered. The vehicles, the forged documents, trying to fit this new, darker shape into the picture. "You're saying I didn't stumble into Nathan's revenge scheme," she said slowly. "You're saying I stumbled into something Nathan was already running, and finding me here was a coincidence that just happened to intersect with a scheme that predates me entirely." "That's what Fraud Division thinks, yeah." "Then this isn't over," Amber whispered. "This was never just about me." Clay's silence confirmed what she already knew. The next call came 2 days later, and this time it wasn't the Fraud Division. It was Amber's sister. Amber had been careful since arriving at Steel Haven to keep contact with her sister minimal, a monthly call from a payphone outside the diner in town, never her cell, never anything traceable. Hearing her sister's name flash across the burner phone Clay had insisted she carry sent ice through her veins before she'd even answered. "Lindsay, what's wrong?" Her sister's voice came through, ragged, breathless, the sound of someone who'd been crying and trying to stop. "Amber, there were men here, 2 of them. Not the investigator from before, different men. They didn't say who they worked for, but they had pictures of you, Amber. Recent ones from the scrapyard." Amber's blood went cold. "Recent? How recent?" "One of them was you standing outside a building with a gray-haired man in a leather vest. It looked like it was taken within the last week. Someone had been watching Steel Haven recently. After Nathan's public humiliation at the failed task force inspection, after his name had surfaced in a state fraud investigation, after every reasonable person would have assumed a man in his position would retreat and lick his wounds through expensive lawyers rather than risk further exposure. He hadn't retreated. He'd escalated. What did they want? Amber's voice had dropped to barely a whisper. They wanted to know if I'd heard from you, if I knew where exactly you were staying. They weren't polite about it, Amber. One of them mentioned my kid's school by name. He knew what time Tyler gets out of soccer practice. Lindsay's voice cracked entirely. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. Call the police. Right now, before you hang up with me. Tell them exactly what you told me and tell them to cross-reference it with the ongoing state fraud investigation into Nathan Mercer case numbers, public record. Now they can look it up. Amber, what is happening? Why won't this end? Amber closed her eyes, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles ached. I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out and I'm going to make sure it stops. I promise you that. She hung up and stood frozen in the yard for a long moment, the late afternoon sun beating down on her shoulders, the familiar sounds of Steel Haven grinding metal, distant engines, Rose's laugh carrying from the front counter, suddenly feeling like they belonged to a fragile temporary peace that could shatter at any moment. Clay found her there minutes later, and one look at her face told him everything he needed to know. Tell me, he said. She told him everything the men at her sister's house. The recent photograph, the threat wrapped in casual mention of her nephew's soccer schedule. By the time she finished, Clay's expression had gone past anger into something colder, more calculated. He's not backing down, Clay said, even with fraud divisions circling him. Even after we humiliated his lawyer in front of a task force, he funded himself. He's doubling down. Why would he do that? He's already exposed. Anything he does now just adds more evidence against him. Because men like Nathan Mercer don't calculate risk the way normal people do, Clay said grimly. They calculate control. Losing you was never really about losing a wife. It was about losing the one thing in his life he couldn't buy back or explain away. His pride can survive fraud charges. It can't survive you walking away and building something better without him. Amber's hands trembled. So what happens now? Clay's eyes hardened into something Amber hadn't seen from him before, not the controlled protectiveness of the past 3 months, but something closer to a promise being finalized. Now, he said, we stop playing defense. Him? What happened over the following week moved with a speed that left Amber's head spinning. Clay called an emergency meeting of the full club that evening. Not just the men Amber knew from the yard, but members from 3 neighboring charters, faces she'd never seen before. Each one listening in grim silence as Clay laid out everything. The fraud, the planted employee, the photographs of Amber taken within the last week, the threats made against her sister's children. Amber sat at the edge of that meeting feeling simultaneously exposed and protected in a way she'd never experienced in her entire life. These were strangers to her, mostly men, with reputations that made polite society cross the street, and every single one of them looked at her not with suspicion or judgment, but with the same quiet, resolute anger Clay had shown from the very first day. This isn't just Steel Haven's problem anymore, said a man. Amber didn't recognize older, heavier scarring along one side of his jaw, a patch-reading road captain. If he's running laundering operations through multiple charters territory using our own people as pawns, that's a declaration whether he means it that way or not. What do you want to do? Clay asked. Same thing you'd do, the man said. We find every thread connecting Mercer Holdings to operations in this region, and we hand it directly to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, wrapped in a bow so tight even his lawyers can't pick it apart. And in the meantime, his eyes moved to Amber, something almost gentle crossing his weathered face. Nobody touches this woman or her family. Not while there's breath left in any of us. Amber's throat tightened, and she had to look down at her hands to keep from breaking apart entirely in front of a room full of strangers who had just without hesitation made her safety their collective responsibility. Over the following days, the investigation Clay and his contacts assembled moved with methodical, relentless precision. A financial analyst connected to one of the neighboring charters, a former forensic accountant who'd left corporate life after his own falling out with a corrupt employer, spent 3 days combing through banking records that Corbin's cooperation deal had opened up. What he found dwarfed everything Amber had uncovered in the trailer's filing cabinets. Nathan Mercer hadn't just planted Corbin at Steel Haven. He had built a network spanning 4 counties using small businesses, scrapyards, auto shops, a handful of construction companies, as fronts for moving money that had no legitimate origin. Vehicle fraud had only ever been a small, almost incidental piece of a much larger operation that had been running for years and generating millions in laundered funds that fed back into Mercer Holdings' legitimate real estate ventures, giving the appearance of clean capital behind properties that, if traced back far enough, had been financed by crime. This is enormous, the analyst told Clay and Amber, spreading printouts across the trailer's newly organized desk, his voice tight with the particular disbelief of someone who'd spent his career around fraud and still found this scale shocking. We're not looking at a jealous ex-husband abusing resources to hunt down his wife anymore. We're looking at a man who's been running a criminal enterprise for years, who happened to marry a woman smart enough that when she finally got access to his paperwork, even accidentally, she started pulling threads that could unravel the entire thing. Amber sat back slowly in her chair, the weight of that realization settling over her like something physical. He didn't just want me back because he couldn't stand losing control, she said quietly. He needed me back. Because as long as I was out here working at a place where I had access to fraud investigators, state officials, financial records, I was a walking risk to everything he'd built. That's exactly right, the analyst said. And it explains something that's been bothering me since we started pulling these records. The task force he funded, the lawyers, the private investigators, that wasn't just about pride or control. That was damage control. He needed you found and neutralized before you accidentally connected dots that would bring the whole operation down. Clay's expression had gone hard and focused, which means the men who threatened her sister weren't sent to intimidate a scared woman into coming home. They were sent to make sure she never talks to federal investigators, the analyst finished grimly. Or worse. The trailer fell into heavy silence, the full scope of the danger finally terribly clear. The next twist arrived that same night, and it came from a direction nobody anticipated. Amber was walking to her car, well past dark, the yard quiet except for the distant hum of security lights, when a figure stepped out from behind a stack of crushed vehicles near the fence line. She froze, heart slamming against her ribs, every instinct, screaming danger before recognizing the face illuminated by the security light overhead. Grissom, Nathan's private investigator. "Don't scream," he said quickly, hands raised, palms out. "I'm not here to hurt you. I need 5 minutes." "Get off this property," Amber said, backing toward the trailer, her hand fumbling for the small alarm Clay had given her weeks ago, the one that would summon half the yard in under 30 seconds. "I know about the laundering operation," Grissom said quickly, his voice low and urgent. "I know because I've been documenting it for the last 8 months. Every wire transfer, every shell company, every planted employee. I have all of it." Amber's finger hovered over the alarm button. "Why would you tell me that?" "Because Nathan Mercer thinks I still work for him," Grissom said. "And he doesn't know that 6 months ago his associates threatened my daughter to keep me quiet about something I stumbled onto, the same laundering operation you and your friends have apparently been unraveling on your own. I've been building a case ever since, waiting for the right moment to hand it to federal investigators without getting myself or my family killed in the process." Amber's mind raced, trying to reconcile the man who had circled her sister's house in a black sedan weeks ago with the person standing in front of her. How? Hands still raised, desperation etched into every line of his face. Why now? Why come to me instead of going straight to the FBI? "Because Nathan just gave the order tonight," Grissom said, his voice dropping, even lower urgency bleeding through every word. "I heard it myself 20 minutes before I drove here. He's done waiting on lawyers and task forces. He's sending men to this property tonight. Not to talk. Not to serve papers." His eyes met hers, dead serious. "You need to warn everyone here right now." Amber's blood turned to ice. She didn't waste time asking more questions. She hit the alarm, and within 90 seconds, the yard had transformed from quiet darkness into controlled, purposeful chaos. Clay emerged from his office, already reaching for his phone, Deacon and Big Sam appearing from different directions with expressions gone hard and alert, Rosa rushing from the front counter with fear written plainly across her face. "Report," Clay barked. "Grissom," Amber said, pointing toward the investigator who stood frozen near the fence line, clearly unsure whether he'd just made the best or worst decision of his life. "He says Nathan's sending men here tonight. Not lawyers, not paperwork. He's out of patience." Clay's eyes moved to Grissom with cold, immediate suspicion. "Why should we believe a word out of your mouth?" "Because I've spent 8 months building a case against the man who signs my paycheck, and I just handed it to the one woman who could actually use it," Grissom said, pulling a thick folder from inside his jacket, holding it out with visibly shaking hands. "Because my daughter's in danger the same as her sister's kids, and I'm done being a coward about it." Clay took the folder, slowly flipping through pages of documentation that made his expression harden further with each passing second. "This is real," he said, finally looking up at Amber. "This is everything we need to end this permanently." "Then we need to move fast," Amber said, adrenaline searing through her veins. "Because if he's sending men here tonight—" The sound of engines in the distance cut her off. Multiple vehicles moving fast, still a few minutes out, but closing rapidly. Clay's expression went granite still, the calm, immovable focus of a man who had faced danger before and refused to let panic dictate his response. He turned to the assembled group, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Everybody knows their positions," he said. "We've drilled this before. Nobody engages unless engaged first. Rosa, get inside the office, lock the door, call the sheriff right now, and tell him exactly what's happening. Amber." "I'm not hiding," Amber said immediately, her voice steadier than she expected, given the fear coursing through her. "I wasn't going to ask you to," Clay said. "I need you documenting everything. Every vehicle, every face, every word spoken. If this goes to federal court, we need it airtight." Amber nodded, pulling out her phone with hands that had somehow steadied, despite the terror thrumming beneath her skin, positioning herself near the trailer's window, where she'd have a clear line of sight to the gate while remaining sheltered from direct exposure. The vehicles arrived 4 minutes later, 3 trucks, no headlights, rolling to a stop just outside Steel Haven's front gate, with the deliberate menace of men who had done this kind of intimidation before. 6 men climbed out, and even from a distance, Amber could see they weren't dressed like lawyers or investigators. They moved with the coiled, purposeful aggression of men hired for exactly one kind of work. Clay stepped forward alone to meet them at the gate, flanked at a distance by Deacon Big Sam and a dozen members from the neighboring charters who had arrived within the hour, having heard Clay's call, and dropped everything without hesitation. "This is private property, Bucky," Clay said, his voice carrying clear and hard across the yard's tense silence. You're gonna want to turn around." The lead man, broad-shouldered with a shaved head and a scar cutting through one eyebrow, studied Clay and the small army standing behind him with the first flicker of uncertainty Amber had seen from any of them. "We're just here for a conversation," the man said. "Nothing that concerns you." "Everything on this property concerns me," Clay said. "And I'm guessing the conversation you're looking for involves a woman who doesn't want to have it. So here's your choice. You leave right now, quiet, no trouble, or you find out exactly what it means to threaten someone standing on land protected by 3 charters instead of 1. The standoff stretched for a long, breathless moment, tension coiling so tight Amber could barely breathe, watching from the trailer window, her phone recording every second with hands that had finally begun to shake. Then in the distance, sirens. Multiple sets growing louder, closing fast, Rosa's call to the sheriff, paying off with speed that suggested the fraud investigation into Mercer Holdings had already put local law enforcement on high alert for exactly this kind of escalation. The lead man's eyes flicked toward the sound calculation crossing his face, weighing the job against the very real possibility of arrest. "This isn't over," he said, echoing words Amber had heard from Nathan himself weeks earlier, and something in the repetition made her almost laugh despite the terror still coursing through her veins. The trucks pulled away moments before the first sheriff's cruiser rounded the bend, and Amber watched from the window as Clay stood at the gate unmoving until the last set of taillights disappeared into the darkness. The sheriff's department took statements for nearly 3 hours that night, from Clay, from Amber, from Grissom, whose defection had turned him from a threat into improbably one of the most valuable witnesses in what was rapidly becoming one of the largest financial fraud cases the region had seen in a decade. By morning, federal agents had arrived, drawn by the scale of Grissom's documentation and the attempted intimidation that had unfolded at Steel Haven's gates overnight. Amber sat across from 2 FBI agents in Clay's office, walking them through 3 months of discoveries: the forged vehicle transfers, the discontinued environmental forms, the planted employee, all of it now converging into a single comprehensive picture of a criminal enterprise that had operated in the shadows for years. "Ms. Collins," one of the agents said, reviewing her notes with obvious respect, "I want to be direct with you. What you've assembled here, combined with what Mr. Grissom's provided, gives us more than enough to pursue federal charges against Nathan Mercer. Not just fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and depending on how last night's events are characterized, potentially witness intimidation and conspiracy to commit assault." "What happens now?" Amber asked, exhaustion and adrenaline warring in her chest. Now we move fast, the agent said. Given last night's escalation, we believe Mercer may attempt to flee or destroy evidence. We'll be seeking an arrest warrant within the next 48 hours. Amber sat with that information for a long moment, trying to process the strange, disorienting relief of hearing that the man who had haunted every corner of her life for 4 years might finally truly be facing consequences that no amount of money could erase. I need you to understand something, the second agent added gently. Cases like this can take months, sometimes years, to fully resolve. There will be a trial. You'll likely need to testify. This isn't over today, even with an arrest. I understand, Amber said. I'm not asking for it to be over today. I'm just asking for it to actually end. Eventually, permanently. The agent nodded, something like genuine sympathy crossing her professional expression. Based on what you and your colleagues have built here, I think that's exactly what's coming. The arrest happened 2 days later, and Amber learned about it not from the news, not from a phone call from investigators, but from Rosa bursting into the trailer with her phone held out, tears already streaming down her face. It's done, Rosa said, breathless. They got him, just now. Live on the local news, they arrested him walking out of his own office building. Amber took the phone with trembling hands. Watching grainy footage of Nathan Mercer, her Nathan, the man who had controlled every corner of her existence for 4 years, who had hunted her across state lines with money and lawyers, and hired intimidation, being led out of his own building in handcuffs. His expensive suit rumpled his face, contorted with a fury that, for the first time in Amber's memory, held absolutely no power over her at all. She watched the footage twice, then a third time, waiting to feel something familiar, fear maybe, or the old instinct to shrink and disappear. Instead, what rose up in her chest was something she hadn't expected. Grief, not for Nathan. For the 4 years she'd spent believing she deserved nothing better than what he'd given her. Clay found her sitting alone in the trailer, 20 minutes later, phone still clutched in her hand, tears finally falling freely down her face. You okay? He asked gently, settling into the chair across from her. I don't know how to feel, Amber admitted, wiping at her cheeks. I thought I'd feel triumphant, or relieved. I feel, she searched for the word, sad, which doesn't make any sense. Makes plenty of sense, Clay said quietly. You're not grieving him. You're grieving the years you spent thinking you had to survive him instead of just living your life. He paused, letting that settle. That's not weakness, Amber. That's just what healing looks like sometimes. Messier than people expect. Amber looked up at him, this man who had given her a chance nobody else would, who had risked his own business and his own safety without a moment's hesitation, who had never once asked what she could offer in return for his protection. Clay, she said quietly, why did you help me really? From the very first day. You didn't know me. You had no reason to risk everything you'd built for a stranger with $40. Clay considered the question for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful in the trailer's dim light. Because somebody did it for me once, he said finally. Long time ago, before this club, before this yard, when I was young and stupid, and running from things I don't talk about much. Somebody gave me a chance, nobody else would, no questions asked, no strings attached. He met her eyes, something quietly resolute in his expression. I promised myself if I ever got the chance to pay that forward, I would. You walked through that gate looking exactly like I did 30 years ago. Scared, desperate, convinced the whole world had already decided who you were. He shook his head slowly. Wasn't a hard decision, Amber. Wasn't a decision at all, really. Just felt like the only right thing to do. Amber didn't trust herself to speak, so she simply nodded, letting the weight of his words settle into the empty spaces inside her that 4 years of fear had hollowed out. Outside the yard continued its familiar rhythm, engines growling, metal grinding, Deacon's laugh carrying across the open air as he worked on a bike that would probably never actually run again. The ordinary, unremarkable sounds of a life continuing forward, unbothered by everything that had almost destroyed it. Amber stood slowly, wiping the last of her tears away, and looked out the trailer window at the yard that had become, against every possible expectation, her home. What happens now? She asked. Clay's answer came without hesitation, steady and certain, in a way that finally truly let something inside her rest. Now, he said, you get to actually live, however that looks, whatever that means. Nobody's controlling that but you. Living, Amber discovered in the weeks that followed, was harder than surviving had ever been. Survival had rules. Survival had a rhythm she'd memorized over 4 years. Anticipate, minimize, absorb, endure. Living had no rules at all, and that terrified her in ways Nathan's threats never quite had, because at least with Nathan, she'd known exactly what she was up against. She was sitting in the trailer on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after his arrest, staring at a stack of paperwork she'd already organized twice when Rosa knocked on the doorframe with an expression Amber had learned to read as trouble. Federal prosecutor's office called the front line, Rosa said. They want you downtown Thursday. Something about pretrial prep. Amber's stomach tightened, the old reflex kicking in before she could stop it. Did they say what specifically? Just that they need to go over your testimony. Practice runs, I guess, before it goes in front of a jury. Rosa hesitated in the doorway. You want me to come with you? I'll be fine, Amber said, though the words came out thinner than she intended. She wasn't fine. She knew it the moment she walked into the federal building 3 days later, past security checkpoints and hallways that smelled like old coffee and fluorescent light, into a conference room where a sharp-eyed prosecutor named Diane Whitcomb sat waiting with 3 thick binders and an expression that suggested she'd spent the last several weeks living inside the details of Amber's marriage more thoroughly than Amber herself had ever wanted anyone to. Ms. Collins, Whitcomb said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Thank you for coming in. I know this isn't easy. It's fine, Amber said again, the automatic deflection surfacing before she could catch it. Whitcomb studied her for a moment, something knowing in her gaze. It's not fine. It's testimony about years of abuse, financial control, and fraud against a man who's going to have very expensive lawyers trying to make you look unreliable, unstable, or vindictive on the stand. It's allowed to not be fine, Ms. Collins. What matters is whether you're ready for it anyway. Amber sat with that for a long moment, something in Whitcomb's directness, cutting through the practiced calm she'd been holding together since the arrest. I don't know if I'm ready, she admitted. I don't know what ready even looks like for something like this. Nobody does the first time, Whitcomb said. That's why we practice. They spent 4 hours that day walking through the timeline, the marriage, the broken wrist, the night she left, the months of hunting the fraud, the intimidation, the standoff at Steel Haven's gate. Whitcomb pushed hard, playing devil's advocate with a coldness that left Amber shaking by the end of each session, forcing her to answer the same brutal questions Nathan's defense attorney would eventually ask in front of a jury. Why didn't you leave sooner? Why didn't you report the injury at the time? Why should this court believe your account over a respected businessman demands? By the time Amber left the federal building that evening, she felt scraped raw, hollowed out in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of her worst days with Nathan. She sat in her car in the parking garage for nearly 20 minutes before she trusted herself to drive, her hands still trembling against the steering wheel. Her phone buzzed, a text from Clay. How'd it go? She stared at the question for a long moment before typing back. Hard. Harder than I expected, the response came almost immediately. You don't have to do this alone. Come home. We'll talk. Home. The word landed differently than it ever had before, and Amber found herself crying in a parking garage 3 counties from Steel Haven. Not from sadness exactly, but from the strange, overwhelming relief of having somewhere that word actually applied to. Clay was waiting at the gate when she arrived along with Rosa Deacon and Big Sam, all of them gathered with the kind of casual loitering that Amber now recognized as a deliberate show of support disguised as coincidence. You didn't have to wait up, she said, climbing out of her car, her voice still raw from the drive. Wasn't waiting up, Deacon said entirely unconvincingly, tightening a bolt on a bike that had already been finished for a week. Amber managed a small, tired laugh despite everything. Right. Clay fell into step beside her as she walked toward the trailer, his presence steady and grounding in the way it had become over the past 4 months. Talk to me. She told him everything, Whitcomb's relentless questioning, the exhausting, humiliating rehearsal of the worst moments of her life, the fear of standing in front of a jury and having Nathan's lawyers pick apart every choice she'd made trying to survive him. They're going to make it sound like I could have left sooner, she said, her voice cracking. Like the fact that I didn't call the police after he broke my wrist means it didn't really happen the way I said. Like 4 years of staying somehow proves he's innocent, instead of proving how good he was at making sure I couldn't leave. Clay stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying a weight Amber hadn't seen from him before, not anger exactly, but something close to it, banked and controlled. You know why people stay, he said. Because leaving isn't a door that just opens. It's something you have to build piece by piece, sometimes over years, especially when the person controlling you has money and lawyers and every institution built to make leaving harder than staying. Anybody who's lived it understands that. Anybody who hasn't, he paused, jaw tight. Their opinion doesn't matter as much as you're giving it credit for. The jury's opinion matters, Amber said quietly. That's the whole problem. Then we make sure they understand, Clay said. Same way we made sure that task force understood. Same way we made sure Nathan understood standing at that gate. You're not walking into that courtroom alone, Amber. Not for one single minute of it. The weeks leading up to the trial passed in a strange blend of mundane routine and mounting dread. Amber continued her work at Steel Haven. The yard had grown in the months since the fraud investigation went public, drawing attention from local news outlets, covering the story of a scrapyard that had helped unravel a multi-county money laundering scheme. New customers arrived daily, some out of curiosity, most out of the genuine respect that came from watching a business survive an attack that would have destroyed a lesser operation. Amber found herself, almost without realizing it, becoming something more than the yard's records manager. Word had spread first locally, then further about the woman at Steel Haven, who'd helped uncover a massive fraud scheme while simultaneously escaping an abusive marriage. She began receiving calls, tentative and quiet, from other women in similar situations. A woman named Patricia hiding from a controlling husband 3 towns over, needing help untangling financial records he deliberately made incomprehensible. A young mother named Teresa, whose ex had frozen her accounts the same way Nathan had frozen Amber's, needing someone who understood both the paperwork and the fear well enough to help her navigate both simultaneously. Amber helped each of them without hesitation, staying late in the trailer some nights, walking strangers through the same process that had once saved her own life, untangling lies hidden in legitimate-looking paperwork, finding the threads that proved manipulation rather than accident, building the kind of ironclad documentation that couldn't be argued away by expensive lawyers. Clay watched this transformation unfold with quiet approval, never commenting directly but making sure the trailer's hours stayed flexible, that the yard's resources were available whenever Amber needed them for the growing informal network of women finding their way to Steel Haven's gates. "You're building something," he said to her one evening, watching her walk a shaking, frightened woman named Diane back to her car after a 3-hour session untangling fraudulent loan documents her husband had forged in her name. "I'm just helping," Amber said. "That's what building something looks like," Clay said. "Most people don't recognize it while they're doing it." The trial began on a gray Monday morning in early autumn, 6 months after Nathan's arrest in a federal courthouse that felt to Amber cavernous and cold, in a way that made her chest tighten the moment she walked through its doors. Clay sat directly behind her in the gallery, along with Rosa Deacon, Big Sam, and a dozen other members of Steel Haven and the neighboring charters who had, without being asked, taken time off work and ridden in from 3 different counties to fill the courtroom's public seating with a wall of leather vests and steady, unwavering support. Nathan sat at the defense table in a suit that looked less expensive than the ones Amber remembered, his face gaunt in a way that suggested the last 6 months had cost him more than just money. His eyes found her once briefly as she took her seat in the witness area, and Amber forced herself to hold his gaze for exactly 3 seconds before looking away, not from fear this time, but from the simple, deliberate choice not to give him more of her attention than he deserved. The prosecution's case unfolded over 4 days, methodical and devastating. Whitcomb walked the jury through the fraud scheme with surgical precision, the laundered vehicles, the planted employee, the falsified environmental filings, the state grant fraudulently obtained to fund a task force designed to harass and intimidate. Grissom testified for nearly 6 hours, his voice steady, despite the visible toll the entire ordeal had taken on him, laying out 8 months of documentation that painted an unambiguous picture of a criminal enterprise spanning years. Then on the 5th day, it was Amber's turn. She walked to the witness stand with her legs trembling beneath her, but her spine straight, her chin level, refusing to let the fear show in her posture even as it screamed through every nerve in her body. Whitcomb's questions came gentle at first, walking her through the timeline of the marriage, the gradual erosion of her independence, the broken wrist the night she finally left. "Can you describe for the jury what happened the night your wrist was broken?" Whitcomb asked. Amber's voice shook as she spoke, but she didn't stop, didn't soften the details the way 4 years of training had taught her to do for Nathan's comfort. She described the argument the moment he'd grabbed her arm to stop her from leaving the room. The sound the bone had made the emergency room visit, where she'd told the doctor she'd fallen because Nathan had been standing close enough behind her the entire time that she hadn't dared say anything else. She watched several jurors' faces tighten as she spoke, watched one older woman near the back dab quietly at her eyes, and something in Amber's chest loosened slightly, the terrifying vulnerability of finally being believed settling into her, like a long overdue exhale. Then came the cross-examination, and Nathan's attorney, a sharp, aggressive man named Fenwick, who had clearly built his career on exactly this kind of dismantling, rose from his seat with the confident, practiced posture of a predator who had done this 100 times before. "Ms. Collins," Fenwick began, "you testified that this alleged incident occurred 4 years ago. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And you never reported it to police?" "No." "You never sought a restraining order?" "No." "In fact, you stayed married to Mr. Mercer for nearly a full year after this alleged incident. Is that correct?" "Yes," Amber said, her voice tightening, the old shame trying to claw its way back up her throat. "Doesn't that seem inconsistent, Ms. Collins, with someone who genuinely believed her husband had violently broken her wrist?" Whitcomb rose immediately. "Objection, argumentative. I'll allow the witness to answer," the judge said, his expression unreadable. Amber sat with the question for a moment, feeling every eye in the courtroom on her, feeling Nathan's gaze burning into her from the defense table, feeling 4 years of carefully cultivated shame trying to reclaim territory it had lost. Then she thought about Clay sitting directly behind her. She thought about the day he'd told her that leaving wasn't a door that opened all at once, but something built piece by piece. She thought about Patricia and Teresa and Diane, all the women who had walked into Steelhaven's trailer carrying the same shame Fenwick was trying to weaponize against her right now. "It doesn't seem inconsistent to me," Amber said, her voice steadying with each word, "because I understand something Mr. Fenwick apparently doesn't. Staying isn't proof that abuse didn't happen. Staying is what abuse trains you to do. Nathan controlled every account in our marriage. He controlled which friends I was allowed to keep, which family members I was permitted to visit unsupervised, how much money I had access to on any given day. Leaving a man like that isn't a single decision you make in a moment of clarity. It's a process you survive long enough to eventually escape if you're lucky enough and brave enough and desperate enough to finally take the risk." The courtroom had gone completely silent. Fenwick's confident posture had faltered slightly, clearly not expecting this level of composed, articulate pushback. "I stayed for a year after my wrist was broken," Amber continued before he could interrupt, "because I believed the way he'd spent years training me to believe that leaving would be more dangerous than staying. I stayed because I had no independent income, no independent support system, and a husband who had made very sure I understood exactly how alone I'd be if I ever tried to walk away." Her voice cracked just slightly, but she pushed through it. "I left the second time I found the courage, not because the danger had changed, but because I had finally found enough strength to accept that danger either way and choose the version of it that led somewhere better." The older juror near the back was openly crying now. Fenwick stood frozen for a long moment, visibly recalculating his approach before finally retreating to a different line of questioning entirely. Amber left the witness stand 2 hours later, her whole body trembling with exhaustion, but something inside her had shifted permanently in a way she could feel in her bones. She had said the words out loud in front of a jury, in front of Nathan himself, without flinching, without softening them for anyone else's comfort. She had finally completely told the truth. The trial stretched across 3 grueling weeks, the prosecution methodically dismantling every layer of Nathan's criminal enterprise, financial expert after financial expert, walking the jury through wire transfers and shell companies and forged documents that painted an increasingly damning picture no amount of expensive legal maneuvering could fully obscure. Nathan's own defense, when it finally came, felt thin and desperate by comparison character witnesses who painted him as a respected businessman victimized by a runaway wife and opportunistic bikers looking to profit from chaos, an argument that grew visibly weaker each time it collided with the mountain of documented evidence Amber Grissom and the financial forensics team had assembled. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Amber sat in the courthouse hallway during those hours, flanked by Clay on one side and Rosa on the other, unable to eat, barely able to speak, her mind cycling through every possible outcome with a kind of exhausted, repetitive dread. What if the jury didn't believe her? What if Nathan's money bought enough doubt to walk free? What if 4 years of surviving him ended in a verdict that told her definitively that none of it had mattered? Whatever happens in there, Clay said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled over their small group, doesn't change what already happened out here. What do you mean? I mean, you already wanted you, Clay said. The moment you walked into that yard 3 months before any of this trial started and decided you weren't going to disappear just because he wanted you to. The moment you looked at that jury and told the truth without flinching, even when his lawyer tried to make you feel small for it. That's the win, Amber. Whatever 12 strangers decide in that room doesn't take that away from you. Amber let the words settle over her feeling. Something steady beneath the terror. Something that felt for the first time in longer than she could remember, like genuine peace rather than the fragile, temporary calm she'd learned to manufacture just to survive each day. The bailiff called them back into the courtroom at 6:47 in the evening. The jury foreman stood a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a steady voice, and read the verdict into a silence so complete Amber could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Guilty, on every count. Fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, witness intimidation. The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended before it finally landed fully in Amber's chest, and something broke open inside her. Not grief this time, not the strange, complicated sorrow she'd felt watching his arrest on television months earlier, but something closer to release. 4 years of fear of small, careful movements, designed to avoid his anger, of believing she deserved nothing better than what he'd given her. All of it finally completely validated as the injustice it had always been. She didn't look at Nathan as the verdict was read. She didn't need to anymore. Behind her, she heard Rosa's quiet sob, felt Clay's hand land steady on her shoulder, heard the low murmur of relief rippling through the row of leather-clad supporters who had shown up every single day of this trial without being asked, without expecting anything in return except the simple radical decision to stand beside someone who needed them. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. Given the scope of the financial crimes, given the witness intimidation charges, given the sheer scale of the enterprise Nathan had built and maintained for years, the prosecution indicated they'd be seeking a sentence that would keep him behind bars for well over a decade. Amber walked out of that courthouse into the cool autumn evening air, surrounded by the people who had become her family in ways blood never had, and allowed herself for the first time in 4 years to simply breathe without calculating the cost of it. The following months moved with a gentleness Amber had almost forgotten was possible. Sentencing came and went 14 years. The judge's voice flat and final as he read the terms into the record, more time than even the prosecution had initially projected, a direct result of the witness intimidation charges stemming from the night trucks full of hired men had pulled up to Steel Haven's gate with intentions that never got the chance to unfold. Nathan didn't look at her as they led him away in handcuffs for the final time. Amber found she didn't need him to. Steel Haven, meanwhile, had transformed into something Clay could never have predicted the day Amber first walked through its gate with $40 and a backpack. The publicity from the trial, combined with the genuine respect the community had developed for a business that had weathered an attack of this magnitude without buckling, had turned the yard into something of a local institution. New contracts arrived steadily. The workforce doubled. Clay, ever practical, used the increased revenue to expand the trailer into an actual office building, complete with proper heating and a computer system that didn't crash every third use. But it was the informal network Amber had built almost by accident, women arriving quietly at Steel Haven's gates, seeking help, untangling financial abuse, escaping controlling relationships, rebuilding lives that men like Nathan had spent years systematically dismantling, that became in many ways the yard's true legacy. Clay formalized it eventually 6 months after the trial ended, calling Amber into his office on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. "I want to talk about something," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "That's never good," Amber said, though she was smiling as she sat. "It's good," Clay said. "I've been thinking about what you've built here. Not the filing system, though, that's saved this business more money than I can count. I mean the other thing, the women who keep showing up at that gate." Amber's expression softened. "I never planned for that to happen. It just happened. Word spread. People needed help." "I know," Clay said. "That's exactly why I think we should make it official. A real program. Legal aid partnerships, financial counseling, maybe even transitional housing eventually, if the club can pull together the resources." He paused, studying her carefully. "I want you running it." Amber sat back in her chair, stunned into silence for a long moment. Clay, I'm not a social worker. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have any formal training for something like that. You've got something better, Clay said. You've lived it. Every woman who's walked through that gate in the last 6 months has trusted you specifically because you understand exactly what they're carrying in a way no amount of formal training could teach somebody. He leaned forward. I've watched you rebuild a fraud case that took down a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. I've watched you testify in federal court without flinching, in front of the man who spent 4 years trying to convince you that you were nothing without him. I think you can figure out how to run a support program, Amber. I think you've already been running one. We're just talking about making it official. Amber felt something rise in her chest, warm and unfamiliar, and entirely welcome. Not the fragile hope she'd carried walking through Steel Haven's gate for the first time, desperate and uncertain, but something sturdier. Something that felt like the foundation of an actual future rather than a temporary refuge from the past. Okay, she said, her voice steady, certain in a way it hadn't been in years. Let's build it. A year later, on a warm afternoon in late spring, Amber stood at the edge of Steel Haven's yard watching a woman named Carol, thin, exhausted, carrying a single suitcase, and an expression Amber recognized instantly because she'd worn it herself once, walk hesitantly through the front gate. Deacon was the one who greeted her first, the same way he'd once sized up Amber, with careful protective scrutiny, though his approach now carried a gentleness that had grown alongside the program's success. He led Carol toward the office building, no longer a crumbling trailer, but a proper structure with a sign out front reading, Steel Haven Outreach, funded partly by the yard's growing revenue and partly by grants. Amber had spent months learning to write, applying the same meticulous, detail-oriented skill she'd once used to catch Nathan's fraud towards securing resources for women just like herself. Amber watched the interaction from a distance, feeling the familiar tug of recognition, the echo of her own first terrified steps through this same gate exactly 2 years earlier. Clay appeared beside her, following her gaze toward the new arrival. Another one, what he said. Another one, Amber agreed. Third this month. Word spreading. Word spreading, Amber said, and something in her voice carried a quiet, hard-won pride that had nothing to do with vindication and everything to do with purpose. We got a call yesterday from a women's shelter 2 states over. Wanted to know if we'd consider consulting on setting up something similar in their region. Clay's weathered face broke into the rare, genuine smile Amber had come to treasure over the past 2 years. What did you tell them? I told them yes, Amber said. Told them I'd need about a month to put together training materials, but yes. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Carol disappear into the office building, watching Rosa emerge with a warm cup of coffee already prepared, watching the yard continue its familiar rhythm around them. Engines growling, metal grinding, the ordinary sounds of a life that had absorbed tragedy and transformed it into something that helped instead of harmed. You ever think about it, Clay asked. The day you drove through that gate, $40 one backpack running from a man who wanted to own you. Every day, Amber admitted. I think about how close I came to driving past, how many times I almost turned around before I got out of the car. What stopped you? Amber considered the question for a long moment, watching the yard she'd once believed was the last resort of a desperate woman with nowhere else to go. Now understanding it as something entirely different, not a last resort at all, but the exact place she'd needed to find herself. I stopped being afraid of the wrong things, she said finally. I spent 4 years afraid of a man who wanted to control me. I almost let that fear keep me from walking through a gate that led to the first place that ever let me be free. Clay nodded slowly, something quietly proud settling into his weathered features. Best decision this yard ever made, letting you through that gate. Best decision I ever made walking through it, Amber said. Behind them, Carol's nervous laughter drifted from the office building. Rosa's doing no doubt the same warmth that had welcomed Amber, now extending outward to every frightened, desperate woman who found her way to Steel Haven's gates. The sound carried across the yard, mixing with engine noise and distant conversation, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. Amber Collins had arrived at Steel Haven Salvage 2 years earlier, believing she had accepted the worst job in America. Filthy work, dangerous work, the last resort of a woman with nothing left to lose. She understood now, standing in the golden afternoon light, watching a new arrival take her first tentative steps toward healing in the exact place Amber had once taken her own, that she had never accepted a last resort at all. She had found the first place in her entire adult life that never once tried to own her. And in that discovery in the family built not from blood, but from loyalty, in the strength she'd rediscovered buried beneath years of careful erosion, in the purpose she'd built from the wreckage of everything Nathan Mercer had tried to destroy, Amber Collins had found something far more valuable than safety alone. She had found herself completely and permanently, and nothing would ever take that away from her again.